I'm Joshua White. I teach here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to SAIS. I'm glad you were not dissuaded by the drizzle or the alarmist text message you might have gotten this morning as a DC resident about a flash flood warning. So in the spirit of Pakistan events, we're going to try not to be alarmist today about the weather or the future. And I'm really pleased to be able to be part of this today, because this is the first of what will hopefully be a long line of events that SAIS does in partnership with LUMS, the Lahore University of Management Sciences, which has really become one of the leading universities in South Asia, and one that's doing a great deal of innovative work. What we're going to try to do today and tomorrow is a few things. One, to try to take a slightly longer view, a slightly longer arc on what's happening in Pakistan and what Pakistan might look like politically and economically and with respect to its strategic environment. We're going to try to introduce a few new voices into the conversation on Pakistan, voices that are at least perhaps new to us here in Washington. And we're going to try to have a candid conversation about Pakistan's future, about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities, and be honest about that. So a bit of a roadmap for what we're doing today and tomorrow. We're going to try to keep the speechifying at a minimum, so we'll not bore you with a long introduction. But we're very pleased to be able to kick off with a panel on Pakistan's political futures, looking at a number of dynamics that will shape the kind of state that Pakistan becomes, and to hear about some interesting research and scholarship that's happening on this topic. After this panel and a coffee tea break next door, in the room next door, I'm very pleased to be able to moderate a conversation about the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. And we sort of racked our brains on how can we add something new to this conversation. And so we decided that we want to look at some of the past dynamics in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship to try to understand the future. So I'm excited about that conversation that we're going to have with some of the most experienced practitioners who have worked on this from the United States government side. After that, today I would encourage all of you to go to an art reception launch, which is happening just one block away in our NITSA building, 1740 Mass Ave, sponsored by SAIS's Foreign Policy Institute, Muse District here in DC, and Indus. And the art is terrific, and there will be some food and drink. And the art is terrific, and don't forget the food and drink. So you will have incentives to come. Tomorrow we're going to reconvene for lunch, and I think we'll have a great conversation about Pakistan's place in the region, co-sponsored by War on the Rocks and the Stimson Center, which have been running a really interesting series about changing geopolitical environment in South Asia. We're going to then have a panel on Pakistan's economic future, hearing from the chairman of the U.S.-Pakistan Business Council, who is a vice chairman of PepsiCo, and a number of scholars from LUMS who work on energy and water and finance issues. And then we're going to conclude with a conversation, lecture and conversation with Pakistan's ambassador, looking at Pakistan's place in the world. And I think it will be a conversation that does not start with the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, but will probably eventually get to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. So I encourage you to join us for all of this, and also to come up to any of us from SAIS and give us ideas about topics we should address in the future and people whom you'd like to hear from here in the DC context. With that, I'd like to just ask Shahzad Habib, a special advisor from Indus, to share a couple of words. Indus is a DC-based think tank that works on building bridges between the United States and Pakistan, and has very graciously agreed to help sponsor the reception later today. And then I want to ask Professor Russell Bakhshais from LUMS to say a few words to kick us off from that side of this new partnership. So with that, please.
It's an honor for me to address this audience on behalf of Indus today. First of all, let me acknowledge the SAIS program And LUMS, thank you for your coming together and putting this excellent event together. I think it's the collective effort will hopefully yield some positive results for Pakistan as we go and discuss these informative and 2 days in the future. Also, I would like to commend the audience for taking an opportunity to come here and to pay attention, hopefully, to positively affect what will unfold for Pakistan in the near future. This event comes at a very timely juncture. It comes at a moment of serious questioning, not just questions for Pakistan, which approaches an election, or for the United States, which considers recalibration of its overall political strategy, but also generally for the regional and political environment in that particular region. In a changing world, what is next for old relationships and new alliances? We will leave this question for the experts to discuss over the next 2 days and hopefully see how we can further the dialogue. As far as Indus is concerned, a little bit about Indus, we are a Pakistan-focused think tank in the US, and we primarily, from a policy perspective, focus on 3 areas related to policy. We provide a constructive platform for exchange of ideas. We offer an informed and independent voice on policy discussion and debates. And we help transform research issues into policy discussions. What makes Indus unique? Well, first and foremost, we are primarily and only focused on Pakistan and Pakistani-American related issues. Indus was created because we recognized there was a white space in the market. There was actually a gap. While we recognize that there are many pockets of Pakistan-related policy-focused organizations and activities within large organizations, there is no Pakistani-American-run policy-focused think tank in the US, and that's the gap that Indus wanted to cover. Indus primarily serves as a convener, a thought leader, and a critical voice between policymakers, diplomatic exchanges, as well as academic institutions between the US and Pakistan. Over the last few years, we have established relationships with multiple universities in Pakistan, as well as think tanks, as well as here in the US. And we work with a very strong network of partners in order to accomplish some of our goals. Our part of our primary goal is to bring this crucial bilateral relationship in South Asia, a relationship that is actually wrestling with some degree of ambiguity and uncertainty. So our hope is that, thanks to the event that Joshua and Rasul Baksh Rais and LUMS has put together, that we will further this cause. And lastly, as far as Indus is concerned, we are objective. We are not here to take sides, neither the US nor Pakistan. We are here to do what's right and from a policy discussion perspective. So thank you, and hopefully you enjoy the rest of the 2 days over here.
Your Excellencies, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good morning. I represent LUMS. My name is Rasul Baksh Rais. For last 4 or 5 years, myself and Josh were in conversation about organizing a conference in the United States. We had a similar conference, Pakistan at 70 last April, at LUMS. And we had about 50, 60 papers over 3 days. But we thought that we take the same conference with somewhat different themes in collaboration with some American think tank or institution or university in the US. While we were talking about it and finding some sponsor, something good happened. And that was an agreement between LUMS and Johns Hopkins to engage in mutual support and also in visits of faculty and students. And one critical component of that understanding and agreement is that we will have each year an annual SAIS LUMS conference in Washington, D.C. Because for decades, I would say, that the chairs we had established at Berkeley and at Columbia have remained vacant for some unknown reasons. And the Pakistani public universities, as well as private universities, have not been that proactive in reaching out to universities and colleagues in the United States. At the same time, because of security situation in Pakistan and Afghanistan, the two very important means of contribution to Pakistan studies and scholarship on Pakistan in the United States seems to have dried up. One was, and has, I think to some extent it survives, American Institute of Pakistan Studies, which is partly supported by the government of Pakistan. The other is Fulbright programs. No scholar, whether undergraduate or graduate or postdoctoral, can go and work on Pakistan. I think for the last 10, 15 years, that has completely dried up that flow of young scholars who used to get interested in Pakistan and study Pakistan. That is a big loss for Pakistan among other major losses that that country has suffered. So this is a modest effort on our part to create that atmosphere of conversation, dialogue, and at the same time inspiring young scholars from the United States to study Pakistan. LUMS has a very short history. It is not as an old institution like Johns Hopkins or many universities that you have been here in the United States. But then within the last 30 years, we have expanded pretty rapidly. At the moment, we have 5 schools. The latest one is education, School of Education. And then the 4th one was Law School. And the 3rd one we had is School of Sciences and Engineering. And the most important one is the one that I belong to, School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Thank you very much for being here. And I look forward to listening to the voices that we have not heard and engage in some meaningful conversation about Pakistan and the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to Johns Hopkins SAIS. My name is Shamela Chaudhary. I work here at SAIS as Senior Advisor to the Dean, and I'm also a Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute. And I have, my background is actually all in the US government working on Pakistan and Afghanistan issues as well as Southeast Asia. So I'm very happy that we're having a full 2 days devoted to this issue because it's very close to me. And I feel like it is very much deserved given the climate right now surrounding the US-Pakistan relationship. And I was mentioning earlier that Pakistan studies was actually what compelled a lot of us to pursue careers in policy. It was an understanding and appreciation of the country and its history and language and people that drew many of myself and my peers to this profession. So I think it's only warranted that we give it the kind of focus we're giving to today. And I want to congratulate Josh White and the South Asia Studies program and LUMS for pulling it off. And I look forward to doing this every year. And also before I start, I see many of my old bosses and mentors in the audience. So if you don't like anything I say, I can point them out to you. No, all that to say that we're a very tight-knit, close community. I look forward to the conversation. I'm just going to say a few brief things, and I really want to give time to our experts and scholars today. The purpose of this panel is to look at the important actors that are shaping Pakistan's political future and long-term political development. And we know who all these actors are because they're in the news every day, and they've played a critical role in the country's history: judiciary, the parliament, political parties, and the security services. One thing I think that doesn't get talked about is the rich democratic culture of the country, and I'm talking about lowercase d, not capital D. And active civil society, it's very involved. There's an engaged media and a very vocal public. But it's actually these institutions that I just mentioned that allow these non-state actors to go a certain pace, right? They determine how fast or how slow this democratic culture can kind of thrive in. And so I think it's very important to kind of take a step back from the headlines and all the voices that we hear and try to understand where these institutions are headed. I think we know a lot about where they've been, but so today's conversation is going to be very future-oriented. And I hope we can get into some of the internal dynamics associated with those relationships, and we have 4 excellent panelists that are going to help us get there. So for example, how do we understand the space that the judiciary occupies today? Is it activism? Is it overreach? Is it actually them pursuing justice? How they interact with the different political players? How will parliament and political parties and elected officials evolve given the current interplay of democratic actors and institutions, especially given the current dynamics on corruption and patronage politics. So Madiha's work has spoken to that. Yasser's work has spoken to the relationship of the judiciary with the military. We'll get into some of those things. Security services, that's an old topic, lots of old questions there. But I'm especially interested in looking at that from a different perspective, mainly we know that the military has different evolving relationships with political parties, elected officials, with the judiciary itself. So how do the military's relationships with each of those institutions affect how they interact with each other on issues that are separate from the military? I think there's something interesting to be talked about there. So I know they're going to answer all my questions today. And joining us, we have via Skype, I believe, is Dr. Asma Faiz. Welcome. She's an assistant professor at LUMS in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. To my right is Mr. Yasser Qureshi. He is a PhD candidate in political science at Brandeis University, coming from Boston today. Dr. Madiha Afzal, who's adjunct assistant professor of global policy here at Johns Hopkins SAIS and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. She just had a new book come out on Pakistan recently, which is really wonderful. And Dr. Leila Bushra, assistant professor of sociology at LUMS. So with that, the format will be that each of our guests will deliver a presentation for 10 minutes. And at the end of that, we'll have a brief conversation amongst ourselves, time permitting, and then we'd like to open it up for Q&A from the audience. So with that, let's begin with Asma. Asma, can you hear us?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, welcome. So we will give you the floor for 10 minutes, and I can't give you, I can't stare at you meanly. I don't know if you can see me, but let's try to keep everyone to 10 minutes. So welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Finally, there was an advantage for not making it in person to Johns Hopkins. Thank you very much. I was very much looking forward to participating in the conference. Sadly, the passport and visa has not arrived. So I'm going to be talking about this very interesting phenomenon of what has been now popularly described as judicialization of politics in Pakistan. This is a paper that I'm working on, and me and another colleague of mine were pitching a proposal to Oxford University Press for the edited volume because we just did a conference on this. So quite a bit thought has been going into it. And what I'm going to be talking about is clash of institutions and looking beyond, especially in Pakistan. So why should we bother about it? Well, we should bother about it because we've seen judiciary, for example, sending 2 prime ministers back home during the last 10 years, since the restoration of judiciary that happened. Yusuf Zagilani in June 2012, Nawaz Sharif in July 2017, under different circumstances, of course, so much so that it has led to some people considering that it has judiciary become the new establishment of Pakistan, following in the train of, and we know anybody who's slightly familiar with the political history of Pakistan usually knows what does it mean to be part of the establishment and who constitutes what is the agency there. And there is this overall narrative which is there that there is some kind of clash of institutions which is going on in Pakistan. And very interestingly, Article 58(2)(b), which for years and years was used as a sword to dismiss political governments, somehow seems perhaps has been replaced by Article 62(1)(f). So just 2-3 days back, former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has been put out of politics for life, the disqualification, etc. And of course, as you mentioned, and even in your, Shamela, in your early remarks, there is this whole interesting way how the corruption accountability nexus works in Pakistan and has worked many a times, and we usually know how the argument goes. So this is some of the things that I have been wondering about. So very briefly, what is the political narrative coming from PMLN? So, and if you have been observing Pakistani politics, you would know that from August to practically today, there is a very clear message which is coming out from the ruling party, PMLN, that this is a people's court which is up against the Supreme Court, and the 5 judges of the Supreme Court which ultimately acted at the Panama verdict actually went against the mass mandate. So this whole pitching of 5 judges versus, the real judge, which is supposed to be people in a democracy. That's the narrative that they are giving. And it hasn't, sadly, the legal process hasn't been helped by the fact, by the kind of the way Panama investigation happened. So if you have been following this trial, you would know that for the last 2 weeks or so, for example, the head of the JIT, the Joint Investigation Team, Wajid Zia, was cross-examined, and which has been widely reported in media. And you see some kind of really remarkable sort of loopholes which seem to have been there. You would think that at least convicting a prime minister, the process would be more rigorous than that. A certain kind of perception does exist. So the political narrative has been that a good judgment does not need any kind of public defense, that, it should be able to meet all the criteria, that the sanctity of the vote is supreme. This is very interestingly sort of matched by the judicial narrative. Usually judges, judiciary, they speak via their judgments. And of course, that is the first, and the ultimate voice that you hear from the judiciary. But very interestingly, the current Chief Justice of Pakistan, Saqib Nisar, suddenly visits the cafeteria of Islamabad High Court and delivers an address. Suddenly visits the, Jinnah Hospital in Lahore and delivers an address also. And seems to be on some sort of defensive mode. So, for example, one of the most often used now articles of Pakistani Constitution, Article 184, which is suo motu. And if you've been following Pakistani politics, you'll see that suo motu is the need of the hour, apparently. On anything and everything, there has been a suo motu. So a few months back, for example, Chief Justice sort of defended himself in public and this very hyperactive kind of role that he seems to have been taking by saying that judiciary is like elder of the village, like a panchayat, like a village community that you have, that I am the Baba, so I am the elder and I know what's best for the nation, so you have to. And later on, he was sarcastically described in the social media debate as Baba Rahmate, since Baba Rahmate, the know-it-all, etc. So that sort of justifies, him suddenly asking for, why did you put why are private medical colleges putting this much fee? These days, there is a suo motu on PIA, for example, the abrupted privatization. There's another suo motu, for example, on the model town killing, etc. And judiciary has been in some sort of a defensive mode also. For example, you see after the dismissal of disqualification of Nawaz Sharif over Akama in July, this was followed then few months later by the dismissal of Jahangir Tareen, the second in command in the PTI and one of the most important politicians, etc., which was described as then a sort of a balancing act, because judiciary had received quite a bit of criticism from various quarters for seeming to especially find fault in one particular party. It was of course not also helped by the fact that when the Panama list originally came, you had ultimately 400 names which were there. And you know how many have been actually investigated? Well, the number is very, very small. So, and ultimately, as a political scientist, one only has to identify the patterns that exist. So, very briefly, why are we bothering about this, and how is judiciary in such a position to be able to be so active? One has to look at overall, one has to map and trace this whole story of judicial independence in Pakistan, which starts with 1986, Al-Jihad Trust, and that's when judiciary becomes active. There was a conflict with Benazir government, followed by the Nawaz Sharif government. But of course, the judiciary's wings were clipped when the PCO and Musharraf's PCO1, PCO2 came, basically. And of course, Musharraf dismissed anybody who was not, any judge who was not willing to take the oath, for example, on his PCO. And that was like the low point. But then came the lawyers' movement, 2007, you're back again. Then, of course, another important milestone when one wants to understand the evolution of judicial independence in Pakistan is the 18th Amendment. When 18th Amendment came and the whole process essentially that how do you appoint judges to the superior judiciary. And that's when there was a retaliation from Shamela Chaudhary-led Supreme Court that no, that let judges be in the majority as far as Supreme Judicial Council is concerned, and that should have the ultimate authority in appointment of judges. So 18th Amendment was followed by 19th Amendment. And of course, we know that Shamela Chaudhary's tenure as Chief Justice of Pakistan and now Saqib Nisar's tenure, you see hyperactivism as far as it is concerned. Is it judicial populism going beyond activism? To a certain extent, it does seem to be fit into the whole paradigm of judicial populism. You issue a statement, for example, questioning the judiciary, and contempt of court is, leveled against it. It was very interesting. For example, there was one when Nawaz Sharif, for example, has been banned for life from politics just 2 days back. And Dawn, the major newspaper, was running a story, and you read through it, and it says that so-and-so lawmakers wanting to be anonymous lest they are charged with contempt of court have said this. Such is the aura of Supreme Court now. And of course, what are some of the examples of how do we say that it's a populist judiciary? By the hyperactive use of suo motu, Article 184. How has the judiciary been active during Saqib Nisar's period? Visiting hospitals, going to medical colleges, trying to dismiss and appoint new, medical boards, questioning the fee structure, questioning the poor governance, for example, the laptop scheme.
If I could interrupt just one more minute, please.
Okay. So I will stop here. I hope there will be more questions on this. But if we are moving forward, we know that hopefully we have elections coming up in Pakistan. There are quite a few controversies, and I would be happy to talk about it in Q&A also, that quite a bit shadows casts are there on elections. For example, the unresolved question of constituency limitation. There is this whole problematic of the caretaker setup because parties do not seem to have a consensus. Very, very interestingly, judges have just been appointed as returning officers, and we know how the legality and the transparency of the last election was actually described in 2013. But judges have been just appointed. The very interesting, curious case of making and breaking of parties in Pakistan. So this mass defection, which seems to be underway from PMLN, MQM, every day, you hear people transferring out of MQM, going to PSP, etc. You have new parties emerging. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the Muslim League. That's just one contender. The new party in Balochistan Awami Party, etc., etc. So you have this very messy party scene. So is Pakistan returning to some kind of normal? My last concluding point. Should we expect judicial activism to continue? Well, it seems if elections go ahead in the current circumstances, we're probably looking at a hung parliament. So we're looking at hung parliament, which means weak legislative majority. At the same time, fresh mandate does bring its own legitimacy. And when Nawaz Sharif was moving towards the final year, it was also described as, his fourth year itch also. So perhaps parliament would be a bit more weaker. There would be a new mandate and honeymoon period, etc. So I'm sorry I had to shortcut through this.
Thank you very much. We'll definitely have time in the Q&A to follow up. I appreciate your remarks. Next, we'll go to Leila.
I work on the political and ideological manifestations of Islamic fundamentalism in Pakistan. To stay away from any controversial comments, we won't use the word fundamentalism today. We can just speak about the rising influence of Islamic groups and organizations in Pakistan. So within this broad category, I've been specifically interested in violence perpetuated by specifically Islamist organizations and groups targeted at religious minorities. And the three groups I've looked at are Christians and Shias and Ahmadis. And there are differences between these three groups. So Christians are demographically an insignificant, a very tiny minority, and they're socioeconomically also the most marginalized group in the country. The Ahmadis are socioeconomically significant but demographically insignificant, less than 1% of the population. The Shias, on the other hand, are socioeconomically significant and also demographically roughly 15 to 20% of the. So when I speak of sectarian violence, then I'm talking about Shias specifically. And again, the difference then also is reflected in how these three communities have been attacked by Islamist groups. So for Shias and Ahmadis, you see mob attacks. The most common way of persecution and violence is charging somebody with blasphemy. That is followed sometimes by mob lynching, sometimes by murder in police custody, sometimes by a death sentence. That's the most normal mode of attack for those two. Some Ahmadis are systematically identified assassinated, those who are in important positions professionally. Shias, on the other hand, the numbers are for Christians and Ahmadis, even if you put together all categories over 30 years, the number is still less than 1,000. For Shias, just for the last 10 years, the number is more than 2,000. Some Shias say it's 20,000 over the last 30 years. I personally cannot verify that number, but it's certainly in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. So, and why the difference in the scale? And again, then the Shia attacks are much better organized, they're systematically planned. Again, if for Ahmadis and Christians, the mode is lynchings and mob attacks. For Shias, these are targeted bombings, recently suicide bombings, targeted assassinations, attacks on their Muharram processions, attacks on their places of worship. The scale is more ambitious, the targets are much better identified, and hence the numbers are bigger. So I was interested in the differences between these three different types of violence. And part of that has to do with the profile of the Shia community. So because of, again, the historical relationship between this region and the Persian Empire, Shias have been historically overrepresented in the landed classes and then also in the professional classes. So whether you went to South Punjab or UP, we even had some Shia princely kingdoms. So again, they were an over-educated professional group. And again, then it's curious why such an influential group would come systematically under attack, to the point where some groups speak of something called the Shia Genocide. Now, that term is debatable, but certainly the scale of violence is large enough to give pause. So, again, the beginning of Shia violence, like the anti-Shia violence, like the anti-Christian and anti-Ahmadi violence, goes back to the 1980s, which is General Zia's rule. But again, it's different because it's not spontaneous at all. It starts with the emergence of self-consciously defined Shia organizations, which then give rise to Sunni organizations. That again, the region has had Sunni Islamist organizations and parties and movements for over a century. But these Sunni organizations were again targeted against the Shias. So on the Shia part, you had organizations like the Imamia student organizations, or Tehreek-e-Nifaz Fiqh Jafriya, or Tehreek-e-Jafriya, and later Sipahi Muhammad. And the trigger was supposed to be the first set of laws that General Zia had introduced that were seen to be carrying a Sunni stamp. So that is the first time that the Shia minority feels threatened enough to react. Otherwise, between 1857 and 1967, the region had seen 6 Islamist movements, all belonging to the Sunni sect, but disagreeing amongst themselves. The interesting thing is that Shias never felt threatened enough to form their own organization. They supported the Muslim League, they supported many of the initiatives that Islamist groups in Pakistan had taken after independence. It's only after 79, with the Iranian Revolution, with this massive influx of Saudi money, and specifically with this new brand of Islamization, or these laws that they was seeking to implement, that the Shia minority felt threatened enough to react, form their own organizations. They successfully resisted the Zakat ordinance. They again staged a very successful sit-in in the capital city of Islamabad. And that is the beginning of what scholars have called the politicization of the Shia and the Sunni identity. And these then led to the emergence of anti-Shia Sunni organizations. Within, again, Deobandi is a very old, one of the most influential Sunni movements in the region. But within the Deobandi umbrella, you get professional organizations systematically targeting the Shia. And the interesting thing is that violence in the 1980s and 90s is primarily between these two different organizations. And one calls them organizations, they're really led by some very influential, visible, charismatic individuals with foot soldiers. And the interesting thing, especially for the Sunni organizations, is that the foot soldiers more or less work like mercenaries. So with the death of one particular leader, the organization tends to become ineffective, which is why we've had the Sunni organizations have taken very many different names. So they started with Sipahi Sahaba, then they become Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, then they become Jaish-e-Muhammad, now they call themselves Ahl-e-Sunnat wal-Jamaat. And again, the leaders are the ones who are important. We can go over the names later if we have time. On the Shia part, again, we see the beginning of violence. The two crucial points are south of Punjab and northwest. 90s, the violence is still bilateral. And again, unlike the other two minorities, Shias are not passive recipients of this violence. There were some Shia retaliations also. So 90s, we see some assassinations, we see bilateral violence, but we already see that there is no way that the Shia organizations can match the infrastructure, the capabilities, the resources, the organization of the Sunni organization. So it becomes more and more unilateral. After 2001, with the rise of the Taliban insurgency, we have an explosion in the scale of violence. We have an explosion in the ambition of those attacks in terms of targeting entire pilgrim buses that are headed toward Iran. So again, just like all other categories of violence, the scale has gone up, the momentum has gone up, and it's become completely unilateral by the time we get to 2010. And the explanations usually are, again, the favorite explanation within Pakistan always is that this is, this Iranian-Saudi war, and they're just using our soil to fight their war. There's no question that there has been international funding for some of these organizations, but I personally think that's just too convenient an explanation. Then there's another explanation of this is a spillover effect of the Afghan war. And again, there is some merit to that because Pakistan wanted a friendly regime in Afghanistan and the Taliban belonged to the Deobandi sect. So there has been some tolerance for Deobandi organizations. One can say even some patronage for those organizations. Then again, sociologists, political scientists who've done more in-depth studies, they've looked at class dynamics in South Punjab and in the northwestern region. And they've talked about the emergence of a new kind of a Sunni bourgeoisie that again is claiming prestige and social honor at the expense of the old Shia elites. And again, that's why their new lifestyle is so self-consciously anti-Shia. So, but my personal interest was more in terms of why the civilian administration fails to control these organizations. And the two most common explanations I've been given are, one, the fact that the judicial system, because of this combination of British laws and then Islamic laws and a lot of executive decisions, has become a completely confused. One of the officials I spoke to said it's a completely dysfunctional legal system. Then fear, they openly confess, civilian law enforcement personnel, they openly confess that fear is. Now, cause for pessimism is that Pakistan has no other national discourse aside from Islam, and that is dominated by Sunnis. So even if state authorities do become very assertive about suppressing violence, as they have with the counter-terrorism plan and the counter-terrorism cells, the fact is we have no other national discourse, and for that reason, these Islamist organizations, as we saw in the capital city and Lahore 2 days ago, they can actually shut down entire cities as and when they want. So they're not violent yet, this latest group of organizations, but they can very well turn violent.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Madiha.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay. It's a real pleasure to be speaking here at this conference, in particular also because I actually graduated from LUMS a long time ago. So this is a particular pleasure. I want to sort of talk about sort of what I see as the key defining features of Pakistani politics and dispel some of the conventional wisdom about Pakistani politics based on empirical data and results, and then shed a little bit of light on public opinion regarding democracy and sort of the validity of democracy in Pakistan. So, it's no surprise to anyone here, but I think it's worth sort of saying this again. But what I see as the key defining feature of Pakistani politics is the dominance of its military and the tug of war, essentially, or the tug of power between the military and civilian governments. And of course, this goes back to the very reason Pakistan was created and the anti-India sort of raison d'etre of the Pakistani military. So it is not something that is really going to go away. So in some sense, that is a feature that we should kind of take as given. What the tug of power between the military and the civilian governments have done is they've led to two features. Regime instability, so the switches between military and civilian governments up until 2008, and also regime uncertainty. Within each civilian government, there's always been a sense of uncertainty about how long this government is going to last. And a military takeover or a dissolution of the civilian government has been imminent. That has an effect on delivery. That has an effect on the performance of these governments. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But public opinion, especially in sort of the rapid dissolution of the governments between 1988 and 1999, public opinion has played a key role. It has actually been sort of the mood in the public that democracy and the civilian governments have been corrupt and have engaged in misgovernance was used to justify the dissolution of the governments. It's been used to justify coups. So public opinion matters. And so that's just a feature to keep in mind. So the two kind of empirical papers that I want to talk about that might shed light on some of the dynamics beyond the conventional wisdom are a paper on dynasticism by some faculty at LUMS, actually, Ali Chima, Farooq Nasir, and Hassan Javed. And then I'll talk about my own paper on incumbency disadvantage in Pakistan, very briefly, and I'll draw out some of the implications and before moving on to public opinion. So what the public seems to really dislike about Pakistani politics is sort of the sense that we have these entrenched politicians who are these rural landowners and they're dynastic politicians, and then they engage in sort of strange practices like horse trading. They move from one party to the other and they're opportunistic about this. So what does the data say? So on dynasticism, it is true, when looking at Punjab alone, that 2/3 of the politicians who were elected in Punjab between 1985 and 2008 were dynastic politicians, meaning that they belong to a family of politicians. But what is also true is that there was a healthy dose of competition between dynastic politicians for a single seat. So it wasn't that it was just one dynasty holding on to a constituency, but two dynasties or dynastic politicians, not dynasties, but dynastic politicians sort of fighting over that seat. That's important to note. So there's competition there. This was more prevalent in rural areas. And this is this kind of idea that there are these powerful candidates, right, that they're powerful beyond being affiliated to a particular political party, kind of explains why there's so much horse trading. Because if a candidate is powerful beyond his political party, they can sort of retain that power by switching to the other party that may be seen as coming into power at the central government level in the next election. So that's sort of one feature. The second that I want to sort of highlight is this a notion of incumbency disadvantage. So in the United States, there is at the sort of the local, electoral district level, there's an incumbency advantage, which means that if you were lucky enough to get elected in a particular election, the next time you, just by virtue of being in power, you are going to be more likely to be elected than somebody who wasn't elected. In Pakistan, not only is there an incumbency disadvantage at the macro level, which means that parties switch power at the macro level, PPP to PMLN to PPP, but there's also an incumbency disadvantage at the local constituency level. So there's a technique called regression discontinuity, which I use to calculate this. And essentially, you look at candidates who barely won an election to those who barely lost an election. And then you look at their probabilities of winning the next time around. And what I found was that candidates who barely won an election, who became the incumbents, were actually less likely to win, 15% on average less likely to win than candidates who lost the election. So there is an incumbency disadvantage that is causal. By virtue of being in power, you've made yourself sort of less palatable to the electorate. And this is this incumbency disadvantage exists for those politicians who belong to the majority party in power at the center. So they come to be associated with sort of the misgovernance and the corruption of the majority party, if you will. And what effect does incumbency disadvantage have? If you see yourself as being likely to be booted out in the next election, your behavior suffers. You're going to engage in extractive sort of policies that benefit yourself. You're going to engage in short-term kind of policy endeavors as opposed to put in place long-term policies. You might engage in some patronage to benefit only those constituents that you think are perhaps useful to you in the long term. So that's sort of one set of features of Pakistani politics. Those make a difference because if there is instability in politics, that basically means that the politician is going to engage in behavior that is useful only to himself. And so that is what we see in Pakistan. So we see misgovernance and corruption. And that renders Pakistan's whole democracy as weakened. So in Pakistan, the conversation in the last few years has kind of changed from this binary, should we have a democracy or should we not conversation, to sort of a conversation about how Pakistani democracy is really flawed. And I want to sort of talk about, so it's not just that the military is trying to destabilize democracy, but there is a squeeze coming in from sort of, I would say, 5 different elements. There's the opposition parties, there's the judiciary, there's the media, there's public opinion, and there is the military. And those sort of factors basically, when the civilian government is sort of seen as being squeezed from all of these sides, it's putting out fires all the time. So it doesn't see a stable time horizon to actually put in place policies that might benefit constituents in the long term. So I want to talk a little bit about public opinion. So until I would say 2008, there was this or up until maybe the early 2000s, sort of this conception that Pakistan isn't really suited to a democracy. I talk about these drawing room elite, the drawing room elite in Pakistan, really sort of just talking about how Pakistan is maybe better suited to technocrats ruling the country, and democracy has yielded nothing but misgovernance and corruption. The mood seems to have shifted in favor of and I think Musharraf's rule, especially the sort of the disaster towards the end, really benefited the cause of democracy in Pakistan. So the mood seems to have shifted towards a preference of democracy relative to dictatorship. So I have this statistic: 84% of Pakistanis in June 2016 said that they preferred democracy to dictatorship in a Gallup poll. So that seems to have stayed. But there's a wariness about how effective democracy is. So in a 2008 Gallup poll, and this number has stayed pretty consistent over time, 54% of Pakistanis said that they were satisfied with the way democracy was going in Pakistan today and the sort of the benefits it yielded. And 45% said they were dissatisfied. This number, really interestingly, differs by urban and rural areas. So in urban areas, more people are dissatisfied. In rural areas, less people are dissatisfied. In fact, in urban areas, a majority is dissatisfied with Pakistan's democracy. That's not surprising, because in Pakistan's elite and the educated classes, there's kind of this, the anecdotal evidence is that politicians aren't really good and they're not going to deliver for constituents. In rural areas, there seems to be more of a belief in the effectiveness of politicians because of patronage politics, because they can benefit directly. In urban areas, patronage is less likely to benefit people because the constituency populations are so large. Do I have a minute or so?
Half a minute.
Okay, all right. So I will wrap up here. So essentially, what I see is, as having changed, looking to the future. Up until about 2008, the conversation, as I mentioned, was sort of very different. In the last 10 years, what we have seen is sort of a respect in democracy as a mode of government, but a squeeze all around it by both opposition politicians who, like Imran Khan, who said that that the 2013 election was rigged, the squeeze coming from the Panama Papers and the corruption scandal, the squeeze coming from the judiciary, the squeeze coming from the Dawn leak scandal and the army, that I feel is tightening. So while democracy isn't going away anytime soon, the idea that politicians will be able to see a time horizon and sort of a stable kind of environment in order for them to perform is no longer there. And I think the line that Pakistan sort of needs to straddle is between being an accountable democracy that can hold its politicians accountable who are corrupt, hold them accountable, and a strong democracy where politicians kind of see themselves as being stable enough to be able to not put out fires all the time. So that's sort of the line, and that's the fundamental struggle in Pakistan. And I don't see sort of much hope for it being straddled in a way that's going to be conducive to civilian governments.
Thank you, Madiha. Yasser, you're next.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be part of this panel today. And I think that given that two of today's speakers, Professor Faiz and me, are speaking about the judiciary, I think it's fair to say the Pakistani courts today occupy a sort of visibility and political relevance that's unprecedented in its history. And, you've heard a lot about the Panama decision today and how it's impacted political thinking. And I think you've heard a lot of rhetoric since that decision from particular supporters of the rural party that the judiciary is sort of operating as a tool or agent of the military. And this makes the question ever more relevant. How would we characterize the relationship between these two institutions today? And my research has traced the evolution of this relationship over the course of Pakistan's history. And in this presentation, I want to make 3 points. I want to discuss this evolution of the judiciary's approach to the military with a little bit more focus on the judiciary as an institution. 2, how that has shaped the relationship today. And 3, what impact do I think this will have on the long-term stability and development of Pakistan's clearly very complicated democracy. So the judiciary has long been labeled in the popular narrative as a collaborator of military supremacy in Pakistan's political system. And particular focus has been placed on multiple occasions when the courts have upheld military coups and provided legal cover to Pakistan's dictators. And in this narrative, 2007 is sort of characterized as a turning point as the judiciary, for the first time, confronted and challenged a ruling military regime. And in my research, though, I found that in the initial period of Pakistan's history, the first 20 years, the military and the courts were closely aligned, as both the process of judicial appointments and the networks from which judges were recruited favored the entrenchment of the military's political agenda. The judiciary was judges were very much a part of the military bureaucracy nexus that reigned over Pakistan's political order. Judges coming from the civil service and the legal elite shared the military's disdain for mass politics and political parties. You have our famous Chief Justice Cornelius of that time describing party politics as an insidious poison. So that should really give you a sense of the sentiments of that period. But I do find, looking at jurisprudence, particularly from the 70s to today, that over time, that period of collaboration, there has been a gradual divergence. And I'd say that's for 2 reasons. One, the judiciary, as Professor Faiz pointed out, for several reasons, moved out of the orbit of the military because of the role of executive institutions in the judicial appointment process was reduced. And 2, the bar of professional lawyers, the legal community from which judges were recruited, grew increasingly supportive of a more oppositional, agitational politics and a more assertive bench. And they pushed for a more interventionist judiciary. And so we saw from the 80s onwards these ideas about populist-driven assertiveness and interventionism transmitted from the bar, from where these judges were coming, to the bench, which is where they reached. And this led to the ambitions of the judiciary increasing, their jurisdiction increasing, and eventually that brought them into conflict both with the civilian branches and with the military. And that's what we saw in 2007 when Iftikhar Chaudhry's court clashed with General Musharraf. And since then, the courts have remained at the center of Pakistan's politics. And the outcome of this court's growing independence and ideological distance from the military has been that the courts and the judiciary now seek to play a similar role as the military in Pakistan's political system, as an arbiter and overseer or guardian of Pakistan's political order. We talk about other states like Turkey as having been guardian democracies, where the military operated as a guardian of the political system. In Pakistan today, both the military and the judiciary seek to play that role as a guardian institution beyond corruption that can bring governance to the country. And this is the spirit in which we must understand the actions of the courts today. So firstly, the Panama decision. In this decision, we saw an alignment of interest between these two institutions as both sought to have a role in selecting and shaping the elected leadership of the state. So the Panama judgment was not, in my opinion, an example of an institution acting as a tool of the military, but as two institutions both seeking to be guardians of the political order and having their interests aligned. Further, with the judiciary seeking to play this more expansive role and entrench its political place in the system, it is acutely aware of its popularity, legitimacy, and political standing. And this is the spirit in which you can understand the controversial decision the courts made in 2015 that upheld the expansion of the jurisdiction of military courts to include civilian terrorists at the expense of the judiciary's own jurisdiction. The military court decision was made in the aftermath of the most horrific terrorist attack in Pakistan's recent memory at the Army Public School in Peshawar. And at the time, there was overwhelming public support for particularly in the cities, for military courts. Both houses of parliament had supported the amendment, and the army was strongly advocating for it. In such a situation, even if judges did not want to lose their jurisdiction, to hold on to it would have undermined their own legitimacy and political standing that they had been building and they clearly value today. And that's the spirit in which you must understand a lot of their decision-making and how they've sort of been selectively assertive. It's true, the courts have challenged the elected branches clearly more than the military, but they have challenged the military as well. And I think they make this distinction between pushing for assertiveness and compliance, and that distinction is important. So for example, on the issue of the practice of enforced disappearances or missing persons during military-led security operations, the courts have certainly challenged and asserted themselves against this practice, but have they pushed for accountability and hold officers accountable? No. On the question of land acquisitions by the military's subsidiary organizations, have they overruled such land acquisitions? In some cases, yes. Have they pushed for compliance? No. On the question of the rigging of the 1990 elections by the military's intelligence agencies, did they rule against such the intelligence agencies in that case? Yes. Have they indicted individual military officers and pushed for compliance with that decision? No. And that distinction is how sort of they are not willing to go that far, but they are willing to assert themselves. And that's a distinction the court makes in its selective assertiveness vis-a-vis the military. But as its ambitions grow, as it adopts the same self-serving anti-corruption rhetoric and uses popular support to legitimize itself, its clashing with the military will become more and more likely over time. And so, you know, what that means is that today the selective, looking at the long term and looking at Pakistan's democracy, the selective nature of the judiciary's assertiveness and how it takes on the elected branches more than the military certainly destabilizes the democratic order of the state. Yet at the same time, this assertive role also complicates the prospect of direct military rule. What we saw with each successive coup d'etat in Pakistan was that the military had to pay a higher price to gain the acquiescence of the judiciary each time and accept a wider role for the courts. And with the activism of the courts today, under Iftikhar Chaudhary and Saqib Nisar, that price will be a lot higher and would shape, therefore, the nature of any political order or regime that follows any direct military intervention. And we already see somewhat the contours of the possible friction between these two guardian institutions. We saw this in the way the two institutions dealt with the issue of the sit-in by the Islamic Party that was mentioned earlier, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik in Islamabad last year. The sit-in exposed the utter weakness and vulnerability of the civilian government. And in this environment, the two guardian institutions sought to establish their roles. The military played the role of the independent power broker and guarantor between the protesters and the government. And the judiciary sought to coordinate the government's response, issuing ultimatums to the protesters, overseeing action of the security forces, and criticizing the actions taken by the military in securing an agreement between the two sides. Both institutions wanted to play guardian, and the space opened up, and the friction between the two institutions was evident. So as the court continues to expand its role in the political system, it may be strategically limiting confrontation with the more powerful military, but eventually more confrontation will become unavoidable. And in the event of a direct political intervention, it would be imminent, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, and with time to spare. Okay,
perfect.
good job. Good job, everyone. Thank you. So I just have a couple of reflections, and then we're just going to open it up to Q&A, because all of you presented very rich kind of narratives on political development in Pakistan. One question, or one topic that I think all of you alluded to and did forecast a little bit about, but I think I want you to think about it some more, especially when we get questions about it, is the ban on Sharif for life, and just thinking about the actual implications of that for the future. Some of you alluded to it, obviously, but if you were, say, doing political risk analysis and a company was wanting to figure out what is the state of this country going to be in the next 5 years, do I need to, should I get involved or should I stay out for a while? Because this is a very serious issue that didn't seem like it was going to get this far. So I would just encourage you to kind of think about that as you respond to everyone. I was very much intrigued by Yasser's presentation. It's something I've thought about quite a bit since I worked at the State Department during the time of Musharraf and Iftikhar Chaudhry, and that we saw that kind of power struggle. And we often wavered between, oh, is this institutional tension or are these personality politics, and should we just wait for someone to leave and maybe things will change? And so I appreciate the context that you put it in. I've long had the view that the judiciary was also occupying space that the military sort of had to give up because of the new position it assumed in the Pakistani public, which was a bit more tense, and that they weren't the guarantors of the security of the nation, and they were perceived as weaker than they were in the past. So I think that's a very good point that you made. And then on Madiha's conversation about dynastic politics, this is the most kind of fascinating thing about kind of South Asia politics, I think, is that we have these dynasties, and there's movie actors and all kinds of people in these dynasties, and they seem to get elected over and over again. I have often wondered what happens when these kinds of politicians shift parties. Do they take their voters with them? And you seem to allude that the voters actually, it's fair game. Once you've become an incumbent, you're actually more likely to lose. And so that leads me to my ultimate question, which is, what do people vote based on? Are they voting based on patronage? Perhaps not then, if they're changing their votes. Or are they voting based on policy? Which is always, I mean, I think we have the question in the United States as well. So, and then finally on Leila's very interesting presentation on sectarianism, also a question about leadership. You talked about the leadership of these Sunni organizations and how they're led by fairly dynamic individuals, and once those people leave, then the mercenaries or the foot soldiers tend to go away. And this is a view that the US government had about Al-Qaeda, and it didn't seem to work because Osama bin Laden is dead, and this organization is not as strong as it used to be, but it's still kind of proliferated into something else. And so my question on that, just for the future, is how does the institutional support that these organizations get, say from the military indirectly, affect the foot soldiers and the mercenaries as well? Or is that something that comes through the leadership? So there, because I think you didn't, I didn't hear a lot about kind of the military kind of relationship with these leaders and organizations. So that's just something to also keep note about. And also with Asma, thank you very much for your very rich presentation. I think you did go into a lot of kind of the forecasting of what will happen in the next election and the impact on the legislative system. And it aligns well with, I think, a lot of the thinking in Washington on the topic. So thank you for that. I'll open it up to Q&A. When you ask a question, please introduce yourself and state your affiliation. And do we have mic runners going around? Okay, there we go.
My name is Sufi Lagari with the Sindhi Foundation. I see the Dr. Asma mentioned about the so-moto questions, so-moto actions by the Saqib Nisar, and a little bit mentioned, Dr. Hugh, that about the missing person. I think disappearance issue is a very major and important issue, and especially because in Fatah, Balochistan, and Sindh province, thousands and thousands of people are disappearing. And I don't know that what will be the impact on the structure of the Pakistan or a state. And Saqib Nisar is not taking the Somoto action because these are Sindhis, Baloch, and Pashtun. Why is that? I want to hear from all the speakers, whoever want to talk about this important issue.
Okay. Any takers?
Should we reply right now?
Or yeah, what's this?
Yeah, I think we have some time, so we can do a little bit of back and forth, and as we run out of time, we can take several questions at the end. It's fine.
Okay, shall I?
Please, yeah. Go ahead, Asma.
Yeah. Thank you, Laghari Saab. Yeah, this is an important issue in the sense also because it immediately reminded me that my own field work for my dissertation was actually on Sindh, and there are so many stories from Jaskam, Jasmam, and some of these Hindi nationalist activists. And of course, the newest and perhaps most important social movement that seems to have emerged, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. They are crying over the fact that you have thousands of Pashtun men who have been missing or who have been tortured, etc. And of course, the Baloch problem. When I was looking at, for example, this post-2007 judiciary in Pakistan, the one, Iftikhar Chaudhary, and that's when he sort of fell out with the military establishment in a way. And then Jawad Khwaja, they were the only two ones. And of course, if one has read one or two decent enough books on political history of Pakistan, one realizes that political class is the best punching bag. You have very little. Ahad Cheema, for example, this scandal which has been there. Ahad Cheema is this top-notch bureaucrat who is affiliated with a housing society, big scam, and who also happens to be very close to Shahbaz Sharif. That's the only bureaucrat that you seem to hear about. Military. You have cases against Pervez Musharraf, while if you followed the drama that led up to the Senate elections, the candidates for PMLN had to contest the elections as independents because their papers were signed on by Nawaz Sharif, and Nawaz Sharif was disqualified, hence those papers could not be legally admissible. But every now and then, at least once a week, some Pakistani TV channel in a primetime TV show does this wonderful interview with Pervez Musharraf, who has so many indictments against him. He's still the president of All Pakistan Muslim League, etc. So which is why I said that there is some sort of accountability, perhaps clarity, which judiciary seems to do, because there is an impression that it is partisan.
Yes, sir.
So thank you for your question. I mean, I actually, being from Karachi and also working on the judiciary's in relation with the military, the missing persons issue is very, very much front and center because you have these sort of assertive statements made by Iftikhar Chaudhary and Jawad Khwaja against the practice, but ultimately very little done. And the truth is, it's because the military is not going to follow the orders of the courts on this question, right? They'll run their security operations how they choose to run them. And in Karachi, that was made very clear in how sort of there's been an ongoing operation by paramilitary forces in Karachi, and there have been some judges who tried to ask tough questions, but very strategically, either these judges were moved off benches where they could actually confront these questions, or were promoted to the Supreme Court, etc., but pushed out of places where questions could be asked, because the military is very clear. This is our red line. You don't cross it. And if you're an institution who cares about your political standing, if you're a judge who cares about his career and other questions, you're not going to undermine that by challenging the military on its most strongest red line. And I think, therefore, I'm very pessimistic that we'll see much happening or changing on the question of enforced disappearances in Pakistan.
I mean, I think the one thing I'd add about the judiciary is, and Asma spoke about this in terms of the suo motu actions, is how much it has been wading into the space of policy in some ways, sort of thinking that the government cannot do its job on providing services like healthcare and education. And so the judiciary is wading into, the Chief Justice is wading into this space by undertaking suo motu actions. I mean, there was this very nice, I have it here, piece in The Economist about this picture of the Chief Justice, which says, judge, benefactor, milkman. And essentially, the idea that they'll they'll wade into the space of the civilian governments, but stay very much behind the red line in terms of the military. And in some ways, the media is the sort of the other. And I know you didn't ask about the media at this point, but the media does the exact same thing. It wades into the space of criticizing the Democratic parties constantly, but stays behind the red line. And if it so much as gets close to the red line, those channels are taken off the air, like Geo has been.
I just want to add one last, just a quote, like when I was doing my interviews and fieldwork, there was one lawyer who I spoke to, and he made this really, I think, a really nice summation of the situation. He said, look, the judiciary and the military both push themselves up by pushing down on the politicians, right? At some point, though, there are no politicians to push down on because you have these two institutions and standing on top of those politicians. What happens then? And that's, I think, the interesting question. As these institutions develop their legitimacy at the expense of politicians, eventually, I think they might clash with each other. So that red line will inevitably, I think, be crossed at some point. Yeah.
Thank you. This woman in the back there.
Thank you for such a rich panel. My name is Sahar Khan. I'm from the Cato Institute. I actually have 3 questions, but I promise I'll make them really quick. My first question is for Yasser and Asma both. In your studying of the judiciary, how is the judiciary dealing with terrorism-related cases? Do you think that they are more aligned with the military, or is it sort of the other way around, that the military is trying to use the judiciary as a tool? My question for Layla is, you talked about an increase in sectarian violence in general. We've seen a lot of conversations about madrasa reform. So in your view, is this madrasa reform specifically targeting a reduction in violence, or how do you think that it will influence these sectarian divides? And my question for Madhya is, we see Fatah now being integrated. How do you think the dynastic parties are going to deal with Fatah essentially becoming mainstream? Thanks.
I think perhaps Yasser would be the best person to talk on it because he was already talking about it. Just very briefly, as Yasser himself mentioned, the 21st Amendment, for example, on top of hand, that comes to mind after the APS massacre. There is this parallel judicial system, and what Yasser very rightly so pointed out is the fact that judiciary very conveniently caved in to the establishment of this parallel judicial system also. And another thing which Aisha Siddiqa in some of her other research has pointed out, Khalid Ahmed has also written about it, is, for example, how you had the example of Malik Ishaq, for example, from Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, a notorious killer. Every time he would get out, the multiple lives of Malik Ishaq, why would he get out also? You can't just blame it on judge also, because the whole prosecution process was very difficult. You wouldn't find anybody to testify against this Islamic militant. Why would anybody put their life in danger when they know that they basically have nobody to protect against them? So every time, there would be a case, Malik Ishaq would walk out of prison. And ultimately, he was killed in an alleged police encounter somewhere in Muzaffargarh, etc. So that would be my thoughts on the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Faiz. I mean, I agree with what Professor Faiz was saying. And I think, when I was doing my research for my dissertation, I had a conversation with, a lawyer who had been very much involved with dealing with terrorist cases and anti-terrorism courts in Karachi. And what he said was, and this is to understand the constraints on a judge, right? When a judge faces the case of a terrorist, how does the case play out? Who comes to you with the intelligence or the evidence? It's probably a military officer or military intelligence person. They will tell you, look, this guy's a bad guy. He's done this. We have videos of what he's done. We really believe he's, committed all these terrible attacks. You have no other source of evidence coming to you because ultimately that's the only source of intelligence. And they've also expressed their interest in seeing that this person is put behind bars. So when the evidence you're getting is coming from the military intelligence, when the military has clearly expressed an interest in how they want the case to go, and as a judge, you are constrained in what other sources of evidence you can get. As Professor Faiz said, the other side is probably too scared to come forward. As a judge, you're probably going to decide in favor of whatever the military expects, right? So therefore, on issues of anti-terrorism, the courts are naturally going to be more deferential to the military because it's structured in such a way that they can't really ask too many questions otherwise.
Did you want to? Okay. So on sort of, I'll speak a little bit more generally about political space opening up and the barriers to entry to politics in Pakistan. But any time political space has actually opened up in Pakistan, new politicians have run for election. The big barriers to entry are, of course, money, because there is not campaign financing or campaign sort of funding the same way as it is in the US, so you have to have your own money. And connections, because party tickets are handed out. Party tickets are handed out in a non-democratic fashion, right? So it's based on connections. Now, that's for party tickets. And people running from particular political parties tend to do well in Pakistan. So, I mean, there are 333, I have the number somewhere here, but 333 political parties registered with the Election Commission. So you would think, so I have it, yes, that's exactly right. So you would think Pakistan is a very vibrant democracy, but only 6 parties hold more than 10 seats out of 342 in parliament. So only 6 parties are really, have any say in parliament, and that's more than 10 seats. So, and 10 seats isn't that big a number. So given that, a political party ticket is what you want to get. Political party ticket is not so easy to get. Still, in some of my research that I did on the disqualification imposed by Musharraf on non-educated candidates, so people who didn't have bachelor's degrees were not allowed to run for office in 2002 and in 2008. It seemed like new candidates were actually coming up. So when barriers to entry are lifted away, new candidates do come up. So that's sort of one thing. I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the question that you had raised on what it is that politicians are kind of rewarded for, or what it is that people actually vote for, given, is it patronage or policy? And I think the really interesting thing in the Pakistani context is that it is not clear who, to the voter, who is implementing policy at the constituency level. There have been so many changing regimes in terms of decentralization. Is it the federal level bureaucrat? Is it the provincial bureaucrat? Or is it the federal level politician, the provincial politician, or the local level politician who is actually responsible for implementing policy, right? And or what people see around them in a particular district. So that is why they turn to things like patronage, because that's something they can see. They turn to things that they can actually see much more visibly, like roads, as opposed to school quality, which is much less visible. You don't really know who's invested in, putting blackboards in a school or bringing teachers to school. So things that are more visible are much more likely to be rewarded. But for certain voters, what matters is actually, because they see the symbol. So for illiterate voters, for instance, what they see is the symbol of the political party. They can't even read the name of the candidate, so they'll vote for the symbol of the political party. So if they are voting out the party that was in power because they perceive that party as being corrupt, and so they want to punish the party, they'll just vote for the other party. So I mean, I think there are a lot of, there's no one answer, but there are a lot of competing things that are going on. But patronage is certainly one of them, and it's really interesting that politicians are given development funds to spend on their constituency, and they'll spend much more of them on very visible things like roads as opposed to healthcare or schooling. Thank you.
Okay. So 2 answers. One, this question of madrasa reform. I didn't talk about it here, but basically madrasa is more than jihad and it's also less than jihad. So we tend to think that, madrasa's only function was to facilitate violence, and that was completely misleading. At least that has been my personal opinion. So you need weapons for jihad, you need infrastructure for jihad, you need good intelligence for jihad. Certainly in the context of 1980s, the northwestern regions, they became associated, certain institutions were set up for jihad and violence, but that was not all that they were doing. So the 2 most famous madrasas in Pakistan, Haqqaniya and Binoria, both of them do a lot more than train militants. So they have, their publishing houses, they have their Darul Fatawas. So in that sense, madrasa is a lot more than jihad. And also, in that sense, madrasas in Pakistan have done a very good job of protecting their autonomy. So Musharraf had talked a lot about reform. Most of the madrasas refused to register because they felt that that was an encroachment. And actually that goes back to the 1960s. In anticipation of Ayub's reforms, the Islamist parties got together and said there is no way certain curriculum is going to be open to him. To the extent that they have started teaching computer sciences, they've started teaching math, they've started coaching students on how to take the GREs, that's again a response to the market. So many Islamic schools now, they don't call themselves madrasas. They are run by, for instance, Jamaat Islami has a huge network of private schools. To the extent that they are reforming, they're doing it again to maintain their autonomy. And that doesn't have much to do with violence, per se. To the extent that there was sort of the rise in violence was related to the inspiration that the Taliban provided. So all kinds of violent attacks became much more ambitious with the Taliban. And the decline also recently, the last couple of years, you can say, is because the civilian and the military institutions are coordinating. The National Counter-Terrorism Authority, which was set up for the police personnel specifically and the counter-terrorism cell, these two were set up specifically to coordinate intelligence, to coordinate better. And we had a chance at LUMS to interact with some of them. And they were very clear that their main function was to get rid of sectarian violence, because that reflects badly on them, given the context. So I don't think that the relative decline in that violence has anything to do with reform. It has to do with the civilian institutions becoming more.
Okay, thank you. Over here, thanks. Oh, no, you don't.
I'm Rizwan Sheikh.
Yep, maybe use the mic so she can hear. Yeah, I think that's right. Good idea. Thank you.
So I start by congratulating both these institutions for having this event. We have been in a very minimal, but perhaps an effective fashion, encouraging both sides to have this kind of an interaction, because we believe that there is a real dearth of Pakistan-specific discourse in Washington, D.C., and particularly since 9/11, there have not been too many interactions, and we end up having more kind of Google experts in Pakistan than the actual experts who have conducted in-depth research on issues like the panel that we see today. And I must commend them on the intellectual integrity of the various papers and presentations that they have made. I have a comment, and I'll follow it up with a question. The comment is that listening to all this, perhaps one thing, and I want the panel to comment on it as well, comes out is that Pakistan is now a democratic country. It emerged as a result of a democratic process, but there had been frequent interruptions. Now, as we understand from the presentations, we are well on the course of democratic path. The debate now is how to make it proper. Propriety is what all these institutions, judiciary, perhaps the media, army, the political class, the people, they're all feeding into. How they're contributing their bit, how do they view it as being properly run or a properly functioning democracy, which certainly is healthy. It is bound to be noisy in not even short, but perhaps the medium term, because of this interplay of forces. But ultimately, perhaps this is an optimistic path that they have taken on, because out of this introspection at the institutional level, something good is going to emerge. Actually, this is the essence of democracy, that institutions, individuals keep discussing with each other how to reform the process. Perhaps one is taking lead at a time, which can be objectionable. But it is heartening to see for us as the bureaucratic class, of course, we have also been referred to as at least one of the famous bureaucrats that came up. I mean, it's currently not in a good shape, but that is important, I think. So what I would want from the panel to briefly comment on is whether they think that this is good and this is a sort of optimistic path to follow. And secondly, there has been reference to guarded democracies like Turkey. There's a difference between Turkey and Pakistan. That guarded part of the Turkish democracy is constitutional. Whatever happened in the Turkish case was part of the Turkish constitution. So perhaps for Pakistan also to follow the correct path and in search of propriety is to either follow the constitution as it is in letter and spirit, or perhaps where reality checks are required, perhaps to amend the constitution suitably as we tread along this path. Thank you. And it was not a diplomatic comment, it was an academic comment.
Thank you. Who would like to start? Shall we ask Asma? Maybe Asma.
Yeah, let her.
Go ahead, Asma.
Yes.
We lost the sound.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so last it reminded me, thank you for the comment and the optimism also. Perhaps we were all a bit too cynical about different things. I was just immediately thinking of a conference that we had at LUMS about a week back, which was on CPAC, but there was a comment that somebody made. And I'm just going to say the comment and it's up to you to interpret. He said Pakistan is very good at engineering apparently. So whichever engineering you're talking about and which part of the system is being engineered, it's up to you to decipher. I'm not going to interpret it or deconstruct it for you. Optimism part, yes, because it seems there is no need for military coup. Yeah, that's a good thing. And I think, really, the political system is not derailed also. We did have local government elections, then we had Senate elections, and if things remain the way they are, we will have elections, we will have second government in a very battered and bruised shape completing its term. I think that's success enough. But of course, we need to have much more than this, much more than this, than what it is. The state of the way political space is, the way political parties are making and breaking, the ethnic discontent that you see from South Punjab to Balochistan to Fatah to Sindh, Karachi, urban and rural, etc. I think we need to move forward, and why not? Hopefully we will continue. And I know resilience, lastly, is an overused word sometimes, but there is resilience. I feel very proud as a Pakistani that within this large belt of Muslim countries, Pakistan by far is one of the most open and competitive political systems. Whenever you have a dictator, 10 years and he's sent back packing, etc. There is quite a bit of resilience, as Shamela herself pointed out, and you have to give credit to political forces for that.
Thank you for your comment. And I think it's, I was thinking about some of the different presentation. I think like Madiha, for example, mentioned 5 different actors squeezing the civilian government, right? And I think what's important about that is that she could name 5 to 6 actors. And that's what's changed about Pakistan, is that we have many more competing power centers. That's why you have the panel that you have here today in Pakistan than you had in its history. And that is interesting and important for how democracy evolves, unfolds in Pakistan. And I think, and it also brings up, I think, something interesting that I think to understand this sort of what's playing out is that when you have so many power centers, the issue is one of institutional bargaining, right? These different institutions are bargaining with each other to establish their place. And I think maybe what sounds pessimistic from my side is just the fact that sometimes this bargaining, I think bargaining is shaped by informational asymmetries, right? Who has more information on you versus who has, the institution with the most information on themselves and the most information on everybody else is the one best equipped to manage the bargaining process, right? And an institution hampered in that informational setup is the weakest in that bargaining process. And unfortunately in Pakistan, we do still have that informational asymmetry, right? The military still has by far the best intelligence on everybody else, and the rest of the society has the least information relatively, right? The judiciary still is has considerable amounts of information on the rest of society, but for example, you can't open accountability cases against serving judges, right? The NAB ordinance does not expand its purview to the judiciary versus the politicians who are consistently vulnerable in this informational game, and that makes their bargaining position weaker. So I think this is a conversation about how do we improve the bargaining position of our elected and our representative governments in this process of institutional bargaining, creating a more accountable and representative democracy. Yeah.
So I mean, in Pakistan is at a juncture, in my view, but there are reasons to be pessimistic that or there are reasons for negativity that can be hopefully seized upon and worked upon to make something positive out of it. So let me say a couple of things. For instance, Pakistan has been a sustained democracy for the last 10 years, but attendance in parliament is very low. It's not clear that parliament does its job the way it's supposed to. Nawaz Sharif himself called all parties conferences to decide major policy as opposed to take the issue to parliament. So why not invest in making parliament the way it's supposed to? That's sort of one thing. The second thing I will say is that overall both governments kind of failed to seize the window of opportunity, both democratic governments, that was provided to it by this kind of stability that had the relative stability that had come into play. They failed to sort of get past the corruption and misgovernance that civilian governments always seem to be mired in. So again, what can Pakistan's democratic governments do to get past that paradigm? That's sort of the second thing. The third thing I'll say, and this is, I think, the biggest cause for concern right now, is that the space to say things, which had sort of increased over the last few years, is being squeezed again. Again, there are pieces being written, but the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, there are people who are trying to write op-eds about it in Pakistani newspapers, and their op-eds are getting shut down, so they're taking to blogs to get the word out. And we don't have to surmise about who's shutting down that space. I've actually also noticed recently, maybe this is with sort of the new administration, that the space for talking about extremism in Pakistan is shutting down, because people, when you talk about extremism, people will say, well, Pakistan has successfully countered extremism, and Pakistan is doing really well. So, why do you keep talking about extremism? Whereas a few years ago, people were because Pakistan was in the middle of an insurgency, people were talking about it. So there are constraints to space, sort of public space and sort of people saying things, which is worrisome. And that space needs to be opened up, as well as sort of new political actors need to be allowed, perhaps new political parties, but certainly new political candidates need to be allowed to come to the fore. And I think if Pakistan can work on each of those instances, it'll be a better place in a few years.
I don't think I have much to add. Much of what needs to be said about.
All right. I think we have time for one more short question and short answer. So please, the gentleman in the back.
Great, thank you. Before I ask the question, let me just say what a privilege it was to listen to all the speakers. And thank you so much for wonderful presentations. I just want to cut to the one big takeaway that I heard from across the panelists, which is that the parties as an actor in Pakistani democracy, even though you see the emergence and strengthening of Pakistan's democracy, parties are being squeezed. I heard that comment, there are 4 or 5 actors all attacking parties. But among all those actors, the only actor that actually gets elected are the parties. The other actors are not accountable to people in the same way. And the reason I want to focus on the parties is because, in addition to governance, delivery of services, parties have traditionally performed another very important role, something which, remains deeply pertinent for Pakistan, which is conflict resolution. Today, a lot of the major parties are restricted to the provinces. They have their major support base only in one particular, or maybe 2 provinces. In a time when major parties are already in retreat, putting further pressure on them And given that these provincial tensions, ethnic tensions have not gone away, what are the prospects of the squeeze on parties on, in terms of Pakistan's ability to manage conflicts in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think interprovincial conflict is a real is a real issue, right? And in Pakistan, the interesting thing, and I think this wasn't mentioned, but the National Assembly, the majority, whoever commands Punjab, in terms of National Assembly seats, commands the country. So they form the majority party, and so that just sets up. Within sort of, just because of the population of Punjab, it sets up the potential for conflict. And to the extent that the PMLN now, to the extent that the PPP has now become much more constrained as a party that belongs to Sindh as opposed to commanding parts of Punjab, it really sort of doesn't open up much space at the central government level. So I think these are all things to be grappled with, and I think sort of the discussion needs to move beyond, well, is Pakistan a democracy or not, to how can Pakistan sort of improve its democracy? What does the delimitation look like? How many seats are going to go where? What does conflict resolution look like? How can we get beyond ethnic and provincial parties, and so on? So I think the conversation, sort of the next step, is to move there.
All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the audience, and thank you to our wonderful panelists for a very rich conversation. We will now have a brief, about 15-minute break, and the next panel is on the U.S.-Pakistan relationship at 2:30 in this room. Yes? Tea and coffee, and please join us for the reception and exhibit at 4:30. Nice to meet you.
Really nice.
Yeah.
Welcome back. I hope you are duly caffeinated and ready for this discussion. I'm very pleased to be able to moderate a conversation on the United States and Pakistan. The purpose of this conversation is to look back so that we can look forward. And I'm privileged to have three superb observers of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship who have worked on the relationship from the vantage point of the U.S. government across multiple administrations. You have their bios in front of you, but I just want to highlight a few of the salient features of their experience. To my far right and your left is Ambassador and Dr. Shirin Tahir-Keli, who is a senior fellow here at the Foreign Policy Institute at SAIS. She served in the Reagan administration on the policy planning staff at State and as Director for Political Military Affairs at the NSC, and then as Director for Near East South Asia Affairs at the NSC. She came back in the George H.W. Bush administration, serving in senior positions at the United Nations, and then in the George W. Bush administration was a Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Democracy, Human Rights, and International Operations at the NSC. I guess when we put all those things together, and all throughout has kept a very significant interest in Pakistan and engagement with Pakistan. And I would be remiss if I didn't help to plug her forthcoming book, which is called Before the Age of Prejudice, a Muslim Woman's National Security Work with Three American Presidents, a Memoir. So do not let the two sets of colons throw you off. It is going to be a really interesting look at her experience working in the national security apparatus. And I'm sure there's a fair amount of Pakistan seasoned throughout the book. So we look forward to that. Next to her, Ambassador Robin Rafel, who's a senior associate at CSIS. She served in the Clinton administration as the first person to hold the position of Assistant Secretary for South Asia when it was wisely hived off of the Near East South Asia Bureau, and then was engaged again during the Obama administration as a key advisor on development assistance under the late Richard Holbrooke. But I would also say that a careful study of her biography would show that she has done a lot of things over the years, from working on economic issues in the late 1970s in Islamabad. I guess you were a staff aide to the Assistant Secretary of the Near East South Asia Bureau in the early 1980s, political counselor in New Delhi, ambassador to Tunisia, someone who has seen this relationship over many iterations and in many seasons. And then to my immediate right, very pleased to have Ambassador Richard Boucher here. He is Senior Fellow in International and Public Affairs at the Watson Institute at Brown University. And he had a long and distinguished career, finishing up with the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service of Career Ambassador. He served in the George W. Bush administration as spokesman for about 5 years, I think the longest tenure on record. Was Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia from 2006 to 2009. Has also worked on economic issues across Asia. And I know you can't see it because we're sitting at the dais, but I do want to highlight that he's wearing socks that have superheroes on them, which is both representative of his stellar career and gives me that precious anecdote that I can use when I go home and my 4-year-old says, "Tell me about your day." And he's not going to be so enthused about, bilateral relations, but hearing that I sat next to somebody with superheroes on his socks will certainly do the trick. So I'm very pleased to be among such distinguished company, and because we are trying to, to look back, to look forward, which is always a risky business. I want to begin by asking each of you, sort of from furthest to closest here, to share with us a moment or an issue in U.S.-Pakistan relations that you dealt with personally, that you found difficult to navigate, and what you think it says, or at least what it says to you about the nature of the relationship. So we'll start there, and then I want to proceed, not chronologically, but sort of thematically, thinking about the analogs that we might draw from past periods of U.S. engagement. So, Master Kelly, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Josh. I am really happy to be here amongst friends and colleagues of long-standing, and to see a sort of a young group of Pakistani scholars taking off, which is just wonderful. And thanks to the LUMS SAIS initiative, in which I know you have been very actively involved. So thanks for the invitation, and it's always great to be up here with my co-conspirators up. So I guess I'll take the early part of the period you've covered. Since I'm 900 years old, I'm going to do the Reagan administration to start with. It was an interesting vantage point, and I guess having had 3 sets of NSC experiences, some of that sort of speaks to the times as well as. It was a 28-person NSC. So, and I had the entire South Asia portfolio plus political military. So there were many difficult moments, but there were busy ones. I went into the NSC, well, I was a state in '82, but just as the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, subsequent to that I went in. So by the time I went to the NSC in '84, there were a couple of issues that were bubbling up, and one tried to manage them from the portfolio I had in collaboration. It was an office, 3-person office that had Dennis Ross, Bill Burns, and myself. For most of the years I was in that portfolio. And one was to sort of deal with the aftermath of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which obviously made Pakistan a frontline state, which brought this resurgence of interactions between the two countries. And there was an effort to create a relationship which dealt with both the issues that keep coming up vis-a-vis US-Pakistan relations. Policy and personality. Both of those tend to be relevant. And I am one of those who thinks that it really was, at least in the times that I've been very much involved in it, not one at the expense of the other. The policy that got going was President Reagan's desire to expel the Soviet Union from Afghanistan and thereby bring about an end to the Cold War as it existed. The personality that he got to deal with on this issue was President Zia-ul-Haq, who was a strong leader and who made his arguments, his country's arguments for why this relationship worked. On the policy side, for the American side, at least from the White House perspective, the convergence of this revival of the relationship was accompanied by a desire to change the dynamic in South Asia if possible, because of the recognition that Pakistan's vulnerability on a true two-front situation would make it harder to get any kind of meaningful collaboration with Pakistan through Pakistan into Afghanistan, if at the same time they were worried about their Eastern Front as we were trying to tell them, you know, get involved. This reality has not changed. In my view, we can go into it later, what difference it made or didn't make. So we were at the same time trying to change the policy of Pakistan's orientation away from this hostile relationship with India, which meant how do we use American, I wouldn't say mediation because it was never mediation, but support for normalization, rapprochement between India and Pakistan, understanding that at the same time you would have to do the Afghan focus. The second issue I would talk about is the nuclear issue. There were not only congressional restrictions on flow of aid, and Pakistan received economic and military assistance in that period. Underpinning that was an understanding that Pakistan would forego the development of a nuclear weapons option. The US was not asking Pakistan to sort of, you know, take out all its scientists or whatever. It was just saying, no, there's a red line, 5% enrichment. You need to hold to that if you want this aid to continue. And there was a certain sort of ambiguity. Some people said, oh, you know, did the government just push it off? Did the White House push it off on congressional sort of requirements? But my own sense is that it was something that people believed in, that a nuclear weapons race would not lead to security and stability in the subcontinent, given all the other issues that were going on. So those are the two that I would.
Thank you. And thank you, Josh, for organizing this, inviting me, and I would like to join Shireen in commending this partnership between LUMS and SAIS. I know it's been a long time in the making, and I'm sure it will prove to be very productive. And also, to second Shireen in saying, it's wonderful to hear young scholars talk enthusiastically and rigorously about the current issues. I found that first session very interesting. Heading back to history, my period of 1992 to 1997, or 1993 to 1997 really, being the first Assistant Secretary of State, is important in the context, which was very different from the context that you all faced. It was the end of the Cold War. The Soviets had left Afghanistan, their empire was collapsing, and this meant that the U.S. felt free to be disengaged from the Afghanistan sphere, lost interest in Pakistan, and there were no major crises in this period to draw attention back to the region. The U.S. felt free to focus on other issues that they hadn't felt free to focus on when they were fighting communism, and particularly the Soviets in Afghanistan. So the focus on non-proliferation returned. We clearly had fudged this issue a bit during the war in Afghanistan to continue Pakistani support, but we were free to go back to it. There was also a concern at the time about support for terrorism. It became very clear that the camps that had been used to train mujahideen were being continually used by the Pakistanis to train people to exfiltrate into Kashmir. And we were beginning to be concerned about what this would mean for Kashmir and potential conflict between India and Pakistan. And of course, later we were concerned about Pakistan's support for the Taliban, because we began to be concerned, listening to other countries in the region, particularly Central Asia, who'd been emphatic about this from the beginning, about an Islamic regime in Afghanistan. And at the same time, of course, we were more interested in India. With the collapse of their supporter, the Soviet Union, India accelerated its economic reforms, became more attractive to the U.S., both as the economic opportunity for trade and investment, but also we were beginning to see this balance of power and to see India as a potential check on China in the region. So I had contradictory goals. The South Asia Bureau had been established at the behest of Congress that wanted more specific focus on, or certain Congress people did anyway, a more specific focus on South Asia, which tended to be lost in the Middle East Bureau, where the focus was on peace process and other kinds of crises. So part of the job was to increase awareness of South Asia and the importance of South Asia, and I used to go around giving speeches of just 25% of the world's population, you know, abundant resources, democratic governments, sort of, strategic location, English-speaking former British colonies, a growing diaspora of influence in the United States. But at the same time, I was supposed to keep South Asia off of the Secretary's desk. And Secretary Christopher did say at the time, and this has echoes today, I sit behind the America's desk. And it was that version in those days of America First, and reaping the dividend of the end of the Cold War. So that was the context. And in that context, the biggest issue that I had to deal with was the nuclear issue. The new orthodoxy, or the old orthodoxy coming forward after the fall of communism, which was very strongly supported by the Congress, probably more so than the administration, was a return to the active enforcement of the non-proliferation policy, which was cap, roll back, and eliminate nuclear weapons in South Asia. We talked about this more with Pakistan than with India, but the policy was essentially the same for both. And of course, we invoked the Pressler sanctions on Pakistan in 1990 after the Soviets left Afghanistan. So we wanted Pakistan to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the CTBT, the MTCR, all of these various agreements. And of course, Pakistan said, well, if India signs them, we will as well. And of course, India said no, so nothing happened. And there was also this increasing concern about an Islamic bomb that Pakistan could easily share its technology with other Islamic countries, specifically Iran. So this was a very central focus of what we did in the South Asia Bureau. Now, as to whether we had any leverage with which to accomplish that, you know, we'd look around. We'd cut off military assistance with Pressler sanctions. We could have restored that. We could have allowed the Pakistanis to take possession of the F-16s they had paid for. President Clinton was very taken by Prime Minister Bhutto's line, which was, you know, give us the planes or give us the money. And we did work hard on this and finally got the Brown Amendment, which allowed some money and some military equipment, but not the F-16s. We could have considered putting Pakistan under a U.S. Nuclear umbrella. We could have been responsive to Pakistan's concerns about India and Kashmir and pushed more on the Indian side. But suffice it to say, there was no stomach or energy or focus to do any of those things, and we were unable to reassure Pakistan on any of its key concerns about India. So they didn't budge. You know, they talked politely. You know, there were discussions and talks and exploratory ideas, but we never really got anywhere on this front. And from Pakistan's side, it was pretty clear they were hedging their bets. They were concerned and beginning to have this view that we deserted them, you know, the discarded like a dirty tissue, that this line that we heard further along for many years. They were worried about the Kalashnikov culture, the drugs, the refugees from Afghanistan. They were worried about India's position with the evolving governments in Afghanistan. They felt that our nuclear policy wasn't fair. There was a double standard. They wanted access to the resources of Central Asia, which eventually caused them to support the Taliban and so on. So we were really at sixes and sevens and didn't really make much progress in this period.
Wow. I think, first thing is I agree with my colleagues that Pakistan's always been hard. Everything was hard with Pakistan. I tended to see Pakistan as a big dysfunctional family. And now that we are a big dysfunctional family too, maybe we can understand each other better. I was Assistant Secretary. I'd worked in and out of Pakistan with Secretary Powell when I went out as spokesman after 9/11 in particular. And then I became Assistant Secretary in 2006, 2009, which I guess I'd say, was the dehyphenation moment. It was no longer, we were very conscious of not making it India-Pakistan. And we were very conscious of not making it AFPAC, which came later and seems to have a legacy still. And that sort of rehyphenation in another direction doesn't do us any good either, in my view. And it's one of the big mistakes of perception in Washington, that the Pakistan relationship is merely the rear end of the war in Afghanistan. We got to get out of that if we're going to have a real relationship working with Pakistan on things that matter. But there were two big threads going on at the time. One was the transition back to democracy. And, in 2006, 2007, it was not just the lawyers' movement. It was the military was tired of being in charge of everything. They were tired of running universities. They were tired of the price of sugar being on their agenda, and they thought they wanted to get back to just maintaining security for the country. And so part of this movement back to democracy came out of the military as well as from pressure from outside forces like the lawyers' movement and Benazir Bhutto and others. And so we worked a lot with them on the transition to democracy, including hiccups like the attempt to fire the Chief Justice. And I find it very amusing now to read what Nawaz Sharif says about the role of the Supreme Court and to listen to some of the commentary because, I first learned the word suo moto in rants that Musharraf would just go off on for 10, 15 minutes at a time about suo moto and the court is a political actor and, what are we going to do? We had to do something, and so this is what I was, anyway. So the court is a political actor, I'm sure has been with us for quite a while. But it was part of the transition to democracy. And we tried to help out in that process as much as we can, working with the military, working with the bureaucracy, working with the different political parties. I met every leader of every political party, even some people who hang out near London. We, made a point of being part of that process and trying to help it along, and particularly in some of the conversations I had between Benazir and Pervez Musharraf. But that, I'd have to say, has been relatively successful. As we've pointed out, we're now about to have our third election in a row in Pakistan. And two governments that finished their mandates. Usually, if you look back at history, the military intervenes after about 7 or 8 years, and this time there's, at least from this distance, no sign that I can see that they're interested anymore. So the transition to democracy is still playing itself out. The democracy is certainly imperfect. The political parties are imperfect. There's a whole lot of things, but it's happened, and I think most of us think that that is going to be a feature of the future life of Pakistan. And the other thread that was playing itself out was the realization on the part of the military and security services that the threat of terrorism was bigger or as big as the threat from India. and that they had to learn how to manage both at the same time. And this was gut-wrenching for many of them who'd grown up in a military where the only thing was India. Gut-wrenching for many of them who felt that militant groups were a tool of state, both in Kashmir, but also remember, we and the Saudis and the Pacs were just funding militants as a hand over fist in the 80s to get rid of the Soviets from Afghanistan. And we were the ones that destroyed the sort of tribal systems in the tribal areas, and really, with our money and with our support, created a sort of a militant mullah complex that ran the war in Afghanistan, and that didn't go away just because the Soviets left. And so in some ways, we were dealing with the after effects of what we created in the 80s, and convincing the military that that was a danger to Pakistan itself, and seeing the military start to deal with it, both in their training and their activities. We sat through countless military briefings of here's how we're going to go into Waziristan. We're going to go here, 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 and then we're going to go down here, and we're going to do this loop, and we're going to come in, and we're going to pacify the place, we're going to take over. And they'd get about 2 steps into it, they get bogged down, they get captured, they negotiate a deal, and go back to nothing for a while. But again, they've done it. And I think after the military operations in Swat and the tribal areas, including Waziristan, you can say for the first time in Pakistan's history, they have control of all their territory. And they're instituting normal governance in the areas that used to be run under an outmoded British colonial system of tribal agents. And so you have a prospect now of an integrated Pakistan going forward together. So they were 2 really tough transitions that we were trying to help them work through. Much of it, all of it, is taking longer than we would have liked. But I think there's some fundamentally positive things in Pakistan. Control of territory, expansion of government, economic growth back above 5%, 3rd election in a row, growing middle class. So if we can continue to contribute to those things, I think we'll do well.
Thank you. That's a lot of rich historical material to start us off, and a lot of threads to pull. And the one that I want to begin by pulling is sort of where you left off, the civil-military question. And it strikes me that sort of over this span of U.S. engagement, the United States has seen various permutations of the civil-military arrangement, and we've shaped different permutations of that arrangement. And I guess to start off with the big picture question, what lessons should we draw about those investments, particularly in the civilian leadership, but also those times we really doubled down on the military, and the fruits of those investments and the assumptions that undergirded them? And just to drill down a little bit on the question, Ambassador Bauchi, I appreciated your anecdote about the transition from Musharraf's rule to the democratic dispensation. But it did strike me that you started at Musharraf's downfall and not at the period in which it was the policy of the United States to really invest in a leader who we thought was valuable for the United States. And I remember this as a grad student. My own confession here is that I would watch your briefings, and I found them to be mesmerizingly impressive, but also frustrating.
At the television.
Yeah, and I would actually speak to the television on occasion. And it was because I'd wandered around in Pakistan and interacted more with the civilian leaders of different parties than with the military. And it seemed like we had a policy that was really investing in the military. Now, stepping back, one, we saw the transition to democracy as Musharraf shot himself in his own foot in multiple ways. But we also, with the benefit of some hindsight, can see the fruits of our investment in the military. And also, I think one of you described as the fudge factors that were required by the United States to invest in the military. So I'd like to step back and ask you about how do you look at the fruits of our respective civil and military investments and the kind of assumptions we brought to it? Did we do so clear-eyed? Did we do so in ways that later surprised us, or ways in which our assumptions about what we were actually building were incorrect? Any of you who want to begin? Yeah.
Okay. It's a question that really does lend itself to kind of a long look back to look forward. So I guess in a sense, on both sides, history has evolved. When security was the main issue that guided US relations with Pakistan, i.e. vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, security at that point really meant dealing, well, there happened to be a military president, but one needed the military might, and one went directly to the source. But even in my last tenure, for example, in government, in the Bush 43 tenure, I not only had the democracy portfolio and human rights, but part of the reason that portfolio existed was of this belief that American national security was tied to security and stability in other countries, which comes from a democratic engagement, support for civil society, for an ongoing sustained relationship. Intertwined in there also was this history of back and forth between military rule and political issues of problems with political sides. Easiest to talk about was the corruption, but there was other kinds of things that went on. Then the issues with the military, including filling all the civilian jobs with military people, which didn't work out so well for them either. So one came, I think at this juncture, if one were to look forward, my sense would be that one is at a point where there is greater depth in Pakistan's civil society, even as some of the institutions that used to be very powerful or were dynamic in their early years have not held up so well, but there are others, and civil society has stepped in to meet a lot of needs. It's more vibrant. There's an expectation of democratic change, and a reticence on the part of the military in getting involved too fast, too soon. And I think coupled with that, one sort of hopes for, the prevalence, because I think a Pakistan that's not a democratic Pakistan, however you define that, is at a much greater disadvantage.
I agree with all of that. I would also add a simpler point, which is that the United States and many other governments tend to deal with the government of the day. We didn't pick it. It might not be what we want, but we deal with the government of the day. And we tend to go to the address that we think can deliver. And I think that was the case certainly in the Musharraf period. And even when there have been civilian governments, we've gone to the military for the security issues, which frankly still dominate in today's Pakistan. But I think where we've been a bit remiss is to fail a bit in the discipline of observing protocol. When there is a civilian government, regardless of whether that's the address that can deliver on a specific issue, one should always engage, I would argue, first with the civilian government. And we got into the habit ourselves, but moreover, congressional delegations got into the habit of stopping in Rawalpindi before they even went up to Islamabad. I think in recent years there's been a real effort to deal with the civilian government, or the civilian government first, the civilian government in conjunction with the military and so on, to correct that habit, which isn't a great habit. I mean, clearly today, the civilian government's rather fraught, and so there are many issues that we deal with the military on, but I think, as I say, we've gotten better in having a more inclusive approach and following the protocol.
Just a brief comment that I think follows on what they said, and particularly Robin's comment that, you know, we deal with government in power and we deal on the subjects that matter to us. And after 9/11, we definitely doubled down or maybe tripled down on the military. You all know about the the famous meeting that Rich Armitage had with the head of ISI, where he didn't say, "I'll bomb you back to the Stone Age," but he must have left that impression that we needed their full and complete cooperation. And we got it for a while. And 9/11 hijackers were picked up. You know, information was passed. Programs were started. Reinforcements and supplies into Afghanistan. That's what mattered. And that's what we doubled down on, and it worked. The realization that the long-term issues were going to have to be dealt with as well was much slower in coming, and that's where, you know, by the time I was assistant secretary, we started to realize that long-term stability was going to be by a reinstatement of democracy, and that keeping the infection from spreading into Pakistan was as important as dealing with the dangers in Afghanistan.
I want to ask about the structure of U.S. interaction with Pakistan. This is a fraught moment in U.S.-Pakistan relations. That's fairly obvious. And at moments like this, I hear from my Pakistani friends, well, one thing that we should do is we should return to the kind of dialogue structures we had when times were better. We should go back to having a high-level dialogue across a broad range of issues. And I think it raises this question about whether those dialogues are really simply the product of a good relationship. You know, for the political scientists in the room, like the dependent variable, or whether they have the potential to be the drivers of a more constructive relationship. You know, the independent variable that you can say, look, times are bad, but let's structure the way we interact with each other, higher and broader and deeper, and that might make a difference. So that's sort of the top-down question I have for you that I think is relevant to looking to the future. And the other one is the bottom-up question. The other thing I hear when times are bad, as they are now, is, well, we really need to focus on people-to-people dialogue. And I've never met anybody who's against people-to-people dialogue. So if there are any of you in the room, you know, please identify yourselves, because you would be the first. Everyone's for people-to-people dialogue. But my question is, from the bottom up, does any of that, did you see any of that trickle up, as it were, to affect the official conversations? Or is that just a nice thing to do all the time to build those kind of relationships? So the structural question, what do you do when times are bad that shapes the outcome of the government-to-government engagement in a constructive way?
Looking at it in terms of my time being bracketed in the initial time, Reagan administration, good relationship, post 9/11, not so good. The structural questions are different. In times of war crises, obviously it's a top-down. In the 80s, you know, people's diplomacy was sort of used not so frequently, but on the other hand, it didn't need to be government-driven. This was a time of very vibrant academic exchanges, students, visas weren't an issue, NGOs. So those links were really the people-to-people of consequence, which I think have helped over these years. Subsequently, by the time post 9/11 era, yes, the strategic dialogue, multiple issues is always interesting. It's always important to have a point of contact. It is important for both sides to know who to reach out to. It doesn't have to be that there's a crisis or there's a terrorist bombing. It's even when there's a trade issue, when there's an important vote at the UN, whatever it is. You want to be able to pick up the phone and call whoever it is that deals with your issue. So that is sort of something that I think is important. It doesn't have to be just at the president or vice presidential level. Those kinds of bureaucratic links, which continue perhaps more on the security side, which is why people do pick up the phone. But how do we cultivate then on the civil society, political, the things like congressional exchanges that were going, which created a cadre of relationships between our legislature and Pakistani parliamentarians. The student things which have been hurt by the sort of the crunch on visas that came. But I think that all of those things, and then there, even in the tough time, the one constituency, at least from the Pakistani and the US side, that did connect, at least in the years that I watched it in my last post, were the women of Pakistan. There's I don't know what the female word for the opposite of bradery is, but there's a certain connectivity there that actually has, and some of them come in and out of power. And I mean, it hasn't just Benazir Bhutto because she was a woman, but there is a certain linkage that I think is a good story. And it sort of quietly moves along.
I would simply add that I think structure does matter. You know, structure imposes regularity, discipline, it builds expectations for progress, and it shows respect one side for the other, I think. And it's no surprise that quite often countries that are smaller than the United States, which includes a lot of countries, want these. They want joint commissions, strategic dialogue is the term in fashion now. And I think these things can be very positive at any time. The problem, of course, is that they take a lot of time, and you can't prioritize them all. So I think we would do well with refining degrees of these things. The Holbrooke strategic dialogue was huge theater and took a theatrical effort to orchestrate it. And cameras and U-shaped tables and everybody with a place to sit and military generals lined up on one side of the table wondering why they were there. But the idea of it, I think the discipline and the structure and the regularity is good. Obviously, people-to-people, diplomats love people-to-people exchanges and love running into people in ministries or universities or somewhere that have been to America. They're easier to talk to, easier to relate to, and helpful in many, many ways for both sides. And it is a shame that security and visa issues, as in part witnessed by our friend who was on the Skype, have gotten in the way of that. Track 2 can be helpful. I mean, I would say about Track 2, it's most helpful when there are actual misunderstandings. When you're at a point where you really do understand both sides, Track 2s can get a little bit stale, and I think that's been the case in Pakistan. But still, it's a good idea to have informal fora. And of course, all the other players now that weren't there 20, 30 years ago of civil society. Women, we have an active U.S.-Pakistan Women's Council, which we established about 4 or 5 years ago, for the very point that Shireen mentioned. These things are important to continue.
I guess my feeling is the more people that talk to other people, the better we are. I'm a deep believer in exchange programs, Fulbright programs, military training at staff colleges, exchanges at staff colleges. There are American military officers that were trained in Pakistani staff colleges and in Quetta and things like that. But those are long-term investments. Those are not how you deal with the issues. And you need a channel for dialogue, and I don't think that's really strategic dialogues. That's not a theatrical event. That's just a regular interaction, frequently by the ambassadors. And I think we've done very well when we had very strong ambassadors in Islamabad who could talk to people throughout the society. Somebody might be able to tell us about how that works, Bill. But, and in this administration, you're starting to see, I think, Lisa Curtis at the NSC and the Foreign Secretary from Islamabad sort of shaping up into that kind of very regular exchange, and I think that's vitally important. But that's not going to solve the issues, because the issues that we have with Pakistan and the region are no longer just U.S.-Pakistan. And they're not going to be solved by U.S. aid cutoffs. I have to say, when I woke up in January and saw the tweets about President Trump was going to hold back the aid and hold back the military payments, and you know what my first thought was? Hey, we did that.
Yeah.
You know, and Robin's telling us she did that.
Yeah.
And you know, you didn't.
No.
Maybe you should have tried it. It would have gotten you nowhere, just like it got with us.
We got somewhere.
I mean, maybe maybe there is something to learn from our experience. But you know, that may get you a discussion of a particular issue with a particular group in the military looking for some reimbursements. But in the end, it's not going to solve the sort of Pakistan in the regional context, Pakistan in the context of Afghanistan and India. And above all, it's not going to solve anything when you got $60 billion coming in from China in the next few years. So, you know, it's not about us anymore. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we're going to start looking for channels that actually deal with the kinds of problems that we can deal with. And I have a soft spot in my heart for the quadrilateral coordination group, because I do think U.S., China, Afghanistan, Pakistan is where a lot of the issues of borders, a lot of the issues of terrorism, a lot of the issues of stability and economic development need to be solved. And I would look for, you know, start out with what are the problems, and then go to how are we going to have a dialogue, how are we going to address them, what the forum is, what the channels are to address those, rather than saying, hey, let's have a dialogue.
We'll make you the QCG patron saint for the next iteration.
Yeah.
One more question before we open it up. Everyone who works in government or works on policy issues carries with them a set of assumptions about the environment that they're working in, about the state that they're engaging with. And as I was thinking about your impressive combined experience, it struck me that there were three assumptions that I've heard and read about in the deeper history that it seems that U.S. policymakers have brought to Pakistan, into the engagement of Pakistan, but which are now fraying or being questioned. And I wanted to put those forward and essentially ask, you know, were you wrong, or did you not actually assume those things, or sort of how is this evolving? The first is that the Pakistani state is fragile, right? And I think there has at times been an assumption behind the exercise of U.S. influence and engagement that the economy is fragile, that something about the social fabric is fragile with respect to militancy, and that the U.S. should engage as if it's engaging a fragile state and a fragile society. The second assumption, I think, flows from it, which is that because the Pakistani state is fragile, the United States should be cautious in the exercise of leverage, and in fact doesn't have realistic leverage over Pakistan, because it's hard to use economic leverage because the state is fragile. We can't use more coercive instruments because the state is fragile, or because the civil military order is fragile. And I think that strikes me as being an assumption behind a certain set of behaviors from this town. And the third builds on what we heard in the first session about public opinion. I think there's been an assumption that the Pakistani public's opinion of the United States matters for the United States' ability to pursue its interests, that we ought to care, we have to care about what the Pakistani public thinks. And again, this has been expressed in a lot of our, not just what we say, but I think how we act. So those are all highly stylized, but I would like to ask about whether whether you think people held those assumptions, whether you think they've been borne out or not, or whether those are so stylized as to not really represent what was driving behavior. Because I think in each of those three cases, there have been questions in recent years, sort of revisiting those particular questions.
Reverse our order here?
Sure, yeah, let's spice it up a little bit.
I think there were a lot of false assumptions or wrong assumptions, but I'm not sure I'd put them quite the way you did. And let me start in the reverse order. The opinions of the people in Pakistan. We cared. We wanted to do things, particularly with the aid program, that directly benefited people in Pakistan, mobilizing for the floods and that sort of thing. But we knew in the end, that some of the things we wanted, whether it was military policy, border control, pacification of the tribal areas, whatever, were in the hands of specific groups and people, usually the military, and that we had to rely on them for it. So, in the build-up to the Iraq War, we went on the offensive to talk more to the Arab world, and I think we got our disapproval ratings in Egypt down from 96% to 93%. And I think we were making that kind of progress in Pakistan too, but under no illusions that we were ever going to get to the level of Lyndon Johnson and the pickup truck. I guess the 1960s again. There was and remains this assumption that Pakistan needs us more than we need them. And that they are in some ways dependent on us, particularly financially, that our aid really matters. So when I got in, we ramped up aid to about, civilian aid to about $1 billion a year, I think it was. And then when Holbrooke and Robin came in, they ramped it up to, what, 2.5, 3.
How much actually went?
That's another question. A lot of it went to Beltway bandits.
Yeah, so ramping it up is...
Some of our former colleagues. But the fact is that it's not just the money coming in from China now. It's the fact that Pakistan has an engine for its economy inside its economy. It has a growing middle class. It has new enterprises. It has entrepreneurs. And it has a mobilizing economy and an active stock market and everything else you want to look for. And so...
And foreign remittances from Pakistanis.
And foreign remittance from Pakistanis in the Gulf, in the U.S. and Canada and elsewhere. So this idea that somehow cutting off $100 million of U.S. aid is going to really, really force them to do something, well, it's nice. I mean, I'd like to have another $100 million in my pocket, but it's not what drives their economy and their development anymore. So we got to get rid of that. We got to look at the place in a broader context. And then I think there's always been a feeling, I would say, based very much on reality, that the military could get stuff done and the civilians couldn't, and that we had to deal with Pakistan in that way, that we would absolutely, be talking to them all, but that when push came to shove, convincing the military that they had to deal with the problem of terrorism or Lal Masjid or SWAT or the Haqqani network, was going to be much more important than convincing the prime minister. And so I think we still operate on that assumption. I hope not exclusively, but I don't think it's been proven wrong.
With regard to your first question, whether or not Pakistan is a fragile state, I don't think Pakistan's a fragile state. I think it's had fragile governments that have fallen or been made to fall. But as a state, all the things that Richard is talking about come into play: the economy, civil society, growing middle class, and so on. So I don't, and number one, I don't think it's fragile, and I'm not sure that that was really an issue, at least not very often. In terms of whether public opinion matters, I think it matters that the United States be seen as consistent, as values-based, that we be respected, but that's not the sort of thing that you can get by, PR campaigns, which I have to say we did try a lot in the last decade or so. One of and the other way that it can't come about is with monetary assistance. And we finally figured that out, and our theme song at the embassy in Islamabad became on this subject: money can't buy you love. We spent all kinds of money trying to figure out, campaigns to advertise what we had done and what U.S. aid had done and so on and so forth. And I personally think that was a big waste of money because people intuitively can tell the difference between humanitarian aid, helicopters rushing, with no other motivation than to be helpful, and other forms of assistance on democracy or whatever it is that could very much look contrived and patronizing if you're on the ground. So yes, it matters. It matters how we behave globally. It matters that we try to represent our own values, but it's not about a PR campaign. And you asked about, did you ask about leverage? You were going to ask about leverage, yeah. Leverage, again, certainly isn't financial. And I don't think negative leverage, as Richard was saying, cutting off this assistance or that assistance, has ever really gotten us much. I think positive leverage could, but we've never been willing to invest in that. Positive leverage looking seriously at Pakistan's concerns and why it is that they're doing things that we don't like or are inconsistent with our interests, and trying to move the ball in a positive way. But that's hard, and we haven't been able to do it.
On the three issues of fragility and public opinion and leverage, I'd agree with what Robin said, that it's had problems, it's had areas of fragility, prolonged fragility, but there are also emerging areas of strength. And this is, so it works out. And particularly in terms of the engagement with the U.S., which is a long-distance relationship at best. Some of the mismatch occurs because, in order to have sustained interaction and deal with these issues, you've got to have the short term and the long term. And for the U.S., the long term is 4 years, from election to election. And it makes for mismatches that, are evident in this relationship. Public opinion, yes, you do have those blips like, the Chinook helicopters in the earthquake in the north, which became just spontaneously Angels of Mercy. It said, I was up in the north for a completely different sort of trip, and it happened at that time, and I've never seen anything that was sort of harking back to the 50s in the way the sentiment that was neutral or positive for the U.S. came out. But, we're living in extraordinary times. I mean, public opinion doesn't matter here in Washington, with our own government. So it's kind of, the power of example is a little lopsided right now. So I don't know how much one can talk about other countries getting it together in terms of their, at least in the near future. And leverage-wise, I think, and I say this after having looked at the issues of sales and nuclear issue as part of a foreign policy series that really went into depth. And you really cannot say that the U.S. has any leverage as such. Influence, the word that we used to like in foreign policy. That this is a very tenuous kind of a term. It may exist from moment to moment where we converge. But the thing is that if you can manage relationship for the next 3 years, let's look at the election cycles, and manage to stay on track with the agreements and the disagreements being dealt with in some, with a sense of purpose to coming to some agreement and agreeing that, okay, on the three things here, we can make it work, and here's how we can make it work, and be realistic about it. I think part of the problem arises when you overpromise and underdeliver on both sides. So I think it can be managed, but management is not a bad term in this day and age. So that's where I would see it going.
Thank you. I think that's a helpful perspective. To be on the question of leverage, to be fair to what this administration might say it's trying to do. You might say Pakistan is more resilient than we've given it credit for, so we can use more negative leverage or more sort of coercive attempts.
Even if it's not going to work.
Well, it's never been tried before. It would be the second point that you would hear. It hasn't been tried to the degree that it would, and that in doing so, you have to do things that will negatively impact public opinion, but we shouldn't really care about that. because that's not fundamental to promoting the U.S. interest. So I think, collectively you provide a perspective and a counterpoint on that. Let me open this up to questions because we have just a great depth of experience here, and we'll start with the gentleman here.
Yes, my name is Sufi Lagaria with the Sindhi Foundation. You mentioned the President Trump's tweet is very important, $33 billion in 15 years, and Pakistan gave us deceit and lies and heaven for the terrorist. This is very important. If you three, let's say tomorrow President invites you in the White House, what advice are you going to give him? Number two, nuclear.
Just one question.
No, disconnect. Nuclear issue is a very fragile too. Pakistan already gave the technology to the North Korea, Libya, Iran. What advice, if the president asks on the nuclear issue, what advice are you going to give to him?
You don't all have to respond.
I'm going to be very flippant and say John Bolton is there. He's the nuclear man. Your turn.
Okay, well, I would ask the president what it was he was trying to accomplish with his tweet, and then give some practical advice. I don't think, the tweet was an emotional frustration, but it wasn't clear what it was designed to accomplish, and I think thus far it hasn't accomplished a thing.
I hope I never get the opportunity.
We'll be diplomatically ill.
But I think the problem we've had for quite a while is not dealing with things as they are, but dealing with them as we wish they would be.
Yeah.
And that does go back to the 9/11 aftermath. Are you with us or against us? Eliminate terrorists and all those who harbor them. And the idea that Pakistan was on our side. Everything we wanted Pakistan would do. And, you got to give them credit. They did a lot. They did a lot in pursuing the 9/11 hijackers. They did a lot in, as I said, helping with supplies and dealing with terrorism issues and all sorts of stuff. And they lost a lot of their own people as well in fighting terrorism and fighting the groups that were going back and forth across the border. Not all of them. But the idea that somehow they were just going to deliver 100%, it's not the way the world works, not the way people work, it's not the way countries work. And it certainly doesn't last, even if you deliver 100% for, maybe the first 6 to 12 months. You don't do it 5 years later. And we don't, if we still operate under the fallacy that, well, whatever we want, Pakistan wants because they committed to it, and therefore they ought to be doing it. And if they're not, they're duplicitous. No, they're just doing their own thing. They're just operating as they are. And until you start understanding countries the way they are and what motivates them and what they're seeking, what they're trying to achieve, I don't think you can understand where your points of coincidence are. So, there are areas of coincidence that, like control of the border, control of the territory, control of the border, development of the economy, areas that we very firmly share interests with Pakistan. And maybe we should just kind of work on those things and not think about this expanded, melding of minds and goals, and just say, it's not transactional. It just says, here's something we can do together. Let's do that and see what happens next.
Yeah, I would add that there really is a certain hubris to, I want what I want when I want it. And, that's kind of a theme we've heard from our side throughout the last 20 years or so. And it's much more productive to take the approach that Richard's outlining.
To sort of take this in a more serious way. In my view, Pakistan and U.S. are both better off when they have good relations with each other. Both of them are important for different reasons. The U.S., after all, is the United States of America. Pakistan is an important country and in a part of the world that the US has major interests in. Its geography is not going to change. It itself is better off when it has a good relationship with the US. So I think the aim ought to be to create a path where, at least if there's not a very close relationship, it's a decent relationship where business is possible and is getting done with communication lines that exist and are being used. I mean, that's a far cry from NATO's non-NATO ally or whatever, but at least at the basic international diplomatic level, that this is a reasonable relationship, even if it doesn't get to be too close anymore.
Let me collect 2 or 3 questions right here, then we'll go down to the front.
Hi, my name is Faika. I'm from the Stimson Center. I have a question for Ambassador Richard. You mentioned how you talked about Pakistan's Lahore movement and how the transition to democracy is still playing out. And you also interestingly mentioned that it was also triggered by the military being tired of governing, in essence. How do you see current events in Pakistan where the Supreme Court has recently passed a judgment curtailing Nawaz Sharif, and which could be seen as the judiciary trying to clip the wings of a political party that's become too powerful or popular for comfort? How do you see that situation, and do you think the US should be concerned at all about that dynamic?
Thank you. Down here in the front.
I'm Naveed. I'm a PhD candidate in public policy at the University of Delaware. And I have a question that we all know that Pakistan is moving fast in terms of strengthening economic relations with China at the moment. And so how does US see that relationship? Because so far what we've seen, so the US has responded cautiously on whenever the questions was raised on China-Pakistan economic corridor. And how would it impact US relations with Pakistan that, the way Ambassador was mentioning, they can double down Pakistan, and that is always, most of the time it's the economic, threat that helps US to do that. So with that sort of, strengthening China-Pakistan economic corridor, how would US, deal with that issue? Thank you.
Great. Is there another question in the back there?
Stanley Kober, also on the economy. I'm looking at a summary of an IMF report from about a month ago. And it starts off very positive. Economic growth has continued to strengthen. But it reminds me of the Soviet editorials I used to read in Pravda. You read halfway down and then you get to the however. You could skip the first half of it and go to the however. And the however here is primarily about Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves. Foreign exchange reserves have been declining. Net international reserves have declined to negative $0.7 billion in mid-February 2018. As a result of fiscal slippages, debt-related vulnerabilities have increased. That, I think, is the concern. It's the debt. The economy may be growing, but it's fueled by debt.
Is there one more question in the back? Yeah.
I'm Seema Siroi. I'm an Indian columnist based in Washington. I wanted to ask Ambassador Rafel and Ambassador Boucher, you dealt with Pakistan and by default with India for many, many years. You said in your presentation that, well, Pakistan told us X, Y, and Z. If India did this, things would be better. I want to know, what was your assessment in terms of, US also has independent assessments of the reality on the ground. So what, in your assessment, really speaking, should India have done, or should Pakistan have done? Not what the Pakistanis were telling you, but what did you think?
If I might just take that one
Please.
quickly, I was referring to the various nuclear agreements and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Missile Treaty and so on, where Pakistan said that if India was willing, and the NPT, if India was willing to sign, they'd be willing to sign. And I think that was probably true. And India, for its own reasons, didn't wish to sign. So, you know, that...
No, but that's not what you
are. That's what I was referring to when I was saying that Pakistan would do what India would do. It was the nuclear issues. What are you referring to exactly?
Generally. Terrorism.
Oh, between India and Pakistan.
Okay.
Oh, you know, I think it's obviously there's enough responsibility to be shared on both sides. No, I mean, and you know, at times when India was ready to talk, Pakistan wasn't. Pakistan be ready to talk, India wasn't. And I think the United States could have done well, or could have encouraged both sides a bit more and a bit more straightforwardly at various points in time. That's all I meant.
I guess maybe we'll try to do all the questions, but start at the last one since it's on the table. When I was working this, we were in regular dialogue with both India and Pakistan about the Kashmir issue. And the Indians would sort of say none of your business and then talk to us a little bit. Pakistanis were probably a little more open about where things stood, but they were having pretty active conversations themselves. They didn't need anybody in the middle of it, and we didn't want to get in the middle of it. We just wanted to kind of continue to encourage progress. And you know, I remember two moments when they were just about there on a deal. They had general concepts of how it should be worked out. They were pretty, you know, just a signature away from working out Sur Creek and Cargill. And at one point, I think, I'm not certain, I think the Indian military vetoed it, and at another point, I know the Pakistani military vetoed it. So, you know, to the extent that we can be helpful and supportive of that, at least it shows we're interested in that bigger set of issues and relationships. But at the same time, you also have the problem in Pakistan of Pakistan's society, meaning military-civilian relationships with groups that support terrorism, including the people who support terrorism against India. Whether it's the Haqqanis who've blown up Indian embassies in Kabul, or the Lashkar-e-Taiba folks who we thought were sort of corralled and quarantined in Mufazabad, who were turning onto the people that planned the Mumbai operation. So I see that as part of sort of dealing decisively with that legacy of Pakistan's relationship with groups, violent groups, that I don't think they've fully dealt with yet. Quick answers on the other, the IMF report, yes, debt is an overhang that's very dangerous, but it's better to deal with when you've got healthy economic growth and vibrant society underpinning it. But yeah, they're going to have to deal with the debt programs and may have to get back into IMF support. Pakistan, China, US, very interesting. And one of the things I fear these days is that we're going to fall into a sort of India, US, Pakistan, China realignment. And that's not going to be good for us or anybody. But there's always this tendency to say, oh, let the Chinese deal with Pakistan and Afghanistan. Oh, boy, do they have something to learn. But the Pakistan corridor is very important to China as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, not because they care about Pakistan, but because they want to get around what they call the Malacca dilemma, where they're imports and exports go through the Straits of Malacca, which is heavily influenced by the U.S. Navy, and the corridors through Myanmar and the corridors through Pakistan are their way to get around that. So they're going to be there. They're going to put money into it, and they're going to have to deal with some of the terrorism problems. You already see some of the Chinese heavy-handedness popping up. There's a story of Uyghur women who were married to Pakistani Baltistanis being picked up and arrested in China. That they're going to have to deal with it. There's stories that maybe they're building a military base in the Wakhan corridor. So I think China has yet to understand what their reaction to terrorism is going to be, but I hope that we don't allow this to fall into a simplistic sort of realignment. And finally, the military and the Supreme Court. I thought the explanation discussion this morning about two players that see each other as the guardians of the state, who end up sometimes being aligned and many times being opposed to each other. I thought that was really interesting because, as I said, Musharraf had his problems with the Supreme Court in many of the same ways that Nawaz did. So at some point, the institutions of Pakistan are going to have to be able to deal with an independent court system, but also have somebody, whether it's the politicians or somebody like an ombudsman, somebody can raise these issues that need to be dealt with. Because not all the issues that the court takes up suo moto are illegitimate. Some of them are a bit weird. But there needs to be some way of these issues getting raised and then adjudicated in a independent and fair judicial system that's not a political player. And the problem is that you have those two things happening within one institution that is become a political player.
I would just add on the China issue. I think in the beginning, the U.S. was a little concerned about CPEC, and on many levels. One level is, speaking of the debt, how quickly the debt will mount. And even though a lot of these are private sector investments, ultimately the government's the guarantor. So it's concern in that regard, and concern about the routing and whether that would disturb the regional equilibrium vis-a-vis India and other countries in the region. But I think now there's a realization that the infrastructure is needed, that China happens to have the capital, that there might be some business opportunities for American companies. I think there already have been a few. But I totally agree with what Richard said, that we need to not fall into this, okay, it's, China does all the infrastructure and that's off our back, and slipping into this two bilateral relationships that might confront one another. But it's I think the official U.S. government policy has evolved over time.
Just quickly, before terrorism and before cross-border terrorism and before the late 90s civil society action on the Indian side of Kashmir, which then tempted people on the Pakistani side of Kashmir, and in the security services, etc., all got going. In the 80s, even at the prime ministerial, presidential level, through the system, there were discussions on ways of making it a better place, of collaboration, of trying to change the relationship. And those are, in fact, the only confidence-building measures that survive, including the agreement of non-attack on nuclear facilities. So history was changed when these issues came in, and so maybe nothing is possible. But I, at least, am glad that they're holding. That may not have expanded, but there's a certain recognition of at least a threshold of what is good for both sides. So I think, the modern, going forward, the issues that we're dealing with are much more complex because it's not a state actor issue. The non-state actor aspect of the relationship has made it much more complicated, and I don't see how you dilute that going forward.
Can I say one more?
Please.
One more quick thing on debt. Christine Lagarde was in the press the other day warning about the potential debt consequences of the Belt and Road projects. And indeed, they're not very transparent. Some of the stories are that China's charging interest rates of 7%, and it's a lot of money. It's nice to have money, but that's pretty stiff in the current environment. And you see Pakistan, Nepal, and Myanmar have all canceled dam projects that the Chinese wanted to build. And so I think there's a lot of shakeout to be done on the economic side of the Belt and Road. We've been the champions of the new Silk Road for going back into the 90s, 2000s. Fred Starr, came up with the phrase.
Pushing it.
Right? And we all gave the speeches, and Secretary Rice gave the speeches, and Secretary Clinton gave the speech, and,
Same speech?
Same speech, yeah.
Same point.
And at some points it looks like the Trans-Afghan pipeline is going to happen, only it's going to go to Iran. I think we have an interest in those connections, and our interest in those connections is not against the Belt and Road and something else in rivalry. Our interest is to see them all get built and all of them flow in two directions. What the problem with any particular connection is it can't just be imports and exports in and out of China go through Pakistan. And contracts, workers, money is all Chinese. It's got to be a road that Pakistan uses and that other people in the Gulf use to get into China and that flows into Central Asia. And, our idea's got to be more connections are always better. We want to webify the world.
Well, I paid Ambassador Boucher for that perfect segue to promote the next panel starting at lunchtime tomorrow on regional issues and Pakistan's place in the region. So I would encourage you to attend that panel, and then what I think will be a great discussion on economic issues after that, and then a discussion with the Pakistani ambassador. Right now, you look like a crowd that wants to look at some beautiful pictures and have some snacks and drinks, so I would encourage you just walk down the street to our main building at 1740 for the launch of the exhibit. And with that, I wanted to thank my panelists here for providing very rich, deep historical perspective. So if you could join me in thanking them. And I will see you down the street in just a few minutes.
It's not raining.
I hope